Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Weight of the Gilded Breath. This is a cryptid horror story about the Balaur, a massive, multi-headed mythical dragon or serpent in Romanian folklore. In this story, a disgraced paleontologist discovers a series of limestone caverns in the Carpathian Mountains. He finds fossils of Balaur bondoc, the stocky dragon, but notices something impossible. The fossils are layered in a way that suggests the creature didn't evolve, but aggregated, growing larger and more complex based on how long it remained undisturbed. He recruits a local guide, Ian, and a team of wealthy, ruthless acquisition specialists, treasure hunters, to find the Hearth of the Earth, a legendary hoard of prehistoric gems. The second story today is called The Echo of Xibalba. This is a cryptid horror story about the Camazotz, a mythological bat deity from Balaur. It is traditionally described as a terrifying, human-sized or giant leaf-nosed bat with razor-sharp claws, associated with night, death, and sacrifice. In this story, a team of 4 expeditionary archaeologists and a local guide are hired to document a newly discovered sinkhole cenote in the Guatemalan highlands. They aren't looking for gold, but for the House of Bats, a site mentioned in the Popol Vuh as a place of trial and death. They find a series of descending stairs that shouldn't exist, carved into the bedrock, leading far deeper than any known cave system. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Weight of the Gilded Breath. It didn't want the gold, you idiots. It wanted the years. The scream tore itself from Dr. Armin Voss's throat with such violence that his vocal cords seemed to shred on the syllables, the words erupting into the cavernous dark not as a warning, but as a final, desperate ejaculation of understanding that arrived far too late to save anyone. He was staring into the abyss, into the space where the air itself seemed to have been displaced by something ancient and patient. And his eyes, those exhausted, bloodshot eyes that had once surveyed the dusty plains of Mongolia and the sun-baked quarries of Utah, were fixed upon a sight that rewrote every principle he had ever held about biology, evolution, and the linear procession of time. The creature's neck was lengthening in real time, the sinewy, stone-gray flesh unspooling from a central mass like a telescope extending toward a distant star, the vertebrae clicking into place with the precise, mechanical inevitability of a clockwork god assembling itself from the raw materials of nightmare. A ninth head was joining the cluster, its jaws unhinging with a wet, membranous pop as the skin stretched and split to reveal rows of teeth that were not teeth at all but calcified growths, mineralized and sharpened by centuries of pressure, each one glowing with a faint, phosphorescent sheen that illuminated the surrounding rock in shades of diseased jade and infected amber. Armin stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the slick limestone, and he thought, with a clarity that bordered on the psychotic, that this was exactly what he had spent 15 disgraced years searching for. Not the gold, not the gems, not the academic redemption that had driven him into these mountains like a penitent seeking a miracle, but this moment of absolute, annihilating truth. The Balaur did not evolve. It aggregated. It accumulated. It grew not through the slow, blind process of natural selection, but through the currency of silence itself, each head a ledger entry in an account kept by the Earth's deepest, darkest bookkeeping. But to understand how Armin Voss arrived at this moment of terminal revelation, one must journey back 3 months to the dust-choked office of the Transylvanian Geological Survey in Cluj-Napoca, where the paleontologist sat surrounded by the debris of a career that had imploded with spectacular and very public finality. The walls of his makeshift laboratory were plastered with photographs and spectroscopic analyses that no peer-reviewed journal would touch. Images of limestone formations in the southern Carpathians that showed impossible stratifications, fossilized remains of Balaur bondoc, the so-called stocky dragon of Cretaceous Romania, embedded in geological layers that span not thousands but millions of years, yet showed no evolutionary divergence. The fossils did not demonstrate the expected morphological drift of 70 million years of isolation. Instead, they showed a creature that had grown not in the Darwinian sense of adaptation, but in the architectural sense of accretion. Armin had spent 18 months poring over samples collected from illegal mining operations, fragments of bone and fossilized tissue that suggested a biological entity capable of adding to its own structure based not on environmental pressure, but on temporal duration. He had published a paper, poorly received, suggesting that the Balaur represented a previously unknown category of life, a chronophage, a time eater, an organism that metabolized stasis and isolation into physical mass. The scientific community had responded with the enthusiasm usually reserved for flat earth theorists and crystal healers. His tenure at the University of Vienna had been terminated. His grants had evaporated. His wife had left him, taking their daughter to Salzburg, leaving him with nothing but a rented office, a hot plate for tea, and an obsession that had calcified in his brain like the very mineralized tissues he studied. It was in this state of professional and personal annihilation that Armin received the email that would ultimately lead him to his death. The message came from a corporate account registered to a shell company called Apex Meridian Holdings, and it contained a single photograph, a high-resolution image of a cave mouth in the Fagaras Mountains, the entrance partially obscured by a recent rockslide, with visible striations in the exposed limestone that matched Armin's own analyses with disturbing precision. The accompanying text was terse and financially explicit. They knew about his theories. They didn't care if they were true in the academic sense. They were interested in the Hearth of the Earth, a legendary hoard of prehistoric gemstones said to have formed in the geothermal vents of subterranean volcanic systems, gemstones that had been mythologized by local populations for centuries as the teeth of the sleeping dragon. The message offered funding, equipment, and a team of acquisition specialists who specialized in retrieving assets from difficult terrain. It offered, in essence, everything Armin needed to prove his life's work, wrapped in the oily language of corporate plunder. Armin, whose desperation had long since crossed the border into moral bankruptcy, accepted without asking the questions that any sane man would have asked, because sanity had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The recruitment of Ion Dumitrescu happened 2 weeks later, in a smoky bar in the mountain town of Victoria, where the locals spoke in the hushed, superstitious tones of people who had lived in the shadow of the Carpathians long enough to know that some shadows moved. Ion was 53 years old, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the treacherous passes and hidden valleys that the modern world had forgotten. He was a gid, a guide in the old tradition, descended from a lineage of shepherds and smugglers who had mapped the mountain's secret arteries through oral tradition rather than cartography. When Armin showed him the geological surveys and the corporate proposals, Ion did not look at the documents. He looked at Armin, his dark eyes narrowing as he rolled a cigarette with fingers that trembled not with age but with a deeply suppressed recognition. "You are looking for the Balaur," Ion said, and it was not a question. "Not the bones, the living one." Armin had laughed, the brittle laugh of a man who had forgotten how to express genuine humor, and he had explained that they were looking for gemstones, for geological formations, for scientific data. Ion had continued to stare at him with the patient, mournful expression of a priest listening to a condemned man's confession. "The gold is the bait," Ion said softly. "The earth uses it to lure the greedy. The Balaur does not sleep. It waits. It counts." Armin, in his arrogance, had dismissed these words as colorful folklore, the kind of peasant mysticism that would make for an amusing anecdote in the eventual memoir he still planned to write. He hired Ion anyway, because Ion knew the mountains, and because Ion was the only guide willing to take them where they needed to go. The team that assembled at the base camp 3 weeks later was a study in corporate ruthlessness disguised as expeditionary professionalism. There were 5 acquisition specialists, sent by Apex Meridian Holdings, each one selected for a specific skill set that had more to do with combat and extraction than with archaeology. There was Marcus Kellerman, a former South African mercenary with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a serpent swallowing its own tail, who served as the team's security coordinator, and whose smile never reached his pale blue eyes. There was Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese-Canadian mineralogist whose fascination with rare earth elements bordered on the erotic, and who carried a portable spectrometer like a holy relic. There were the Voss brothers, Dieter and France, Austrian twins who had made their fortune in private security and extreme tourism, and who viewed the expedition as an elaborate adventure holiday with a potentially lucrative payout. And there was Marguerite Maggie Chevalier, a French speleologist whose reputation for descending into caves that no human had ever exited alive had made her a legend in the tight-knit community of extreme cavers. They were, Armin reflected as he watched them unpack their equipment in the alpine meadow that served as their staging ground, the perfect congregation of hubris. They had money, weapons, technology, and the absolute certainty that the natural world could be conquered by those who possessed sufficient firepower and greed. Armin, standing apart from them with his worn field journal and his second-hand climbing gear, felt a momentary shiver of premonition that he mistook for altitude sickness. The descent began on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the first snows had already dusted the higher peaks, and the air carried the sharp, metallic scent of approaching winter. Ian led them along a trail that was not on any map, a narrow switchback carved into the face of a limestone cliff that descended into a valley so deep and shadowed that the sun never reached its floor. They walked in single file, the specialists maintaining a running commentary on the geological formations, the mineral deposits visible in the exposed rock faces, the potential value of the site based on preliminary spectroscopic readings. Armin listened to them with a growing sense of disconnection, their voices seeming to flatten and distort as they descended, as if the acoustics of the valley were designed to render human speech irrelevant. Ian walked in front, silent, his old leather boots finding purchase on surfaces that should have been treacherous, his eyes constantly scanning the cliff faces with an expression of wary recognition. After 6 hours of descent, they reached the entrance to the salt mine system that Ian had described in his terse briefings, a narrow opening in the rock, partially concealed by a curtain of dead vines, from which issued a current of air so warm and so heavy that it felt like walking into a submerged room. "This is where we leave the sun," Ian said, and his voice, usually soft, carried an undertone of finality that made even Kellerman pause in his examination of his sidearm. The guide lit a carbide lamp, the acetylene flame casting a harsh white light that pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal the beginning of a tunnel system carved into the salt deposits by ancient brine flows. The walls glittered with cubic halite crystals that reflected the lamplight in 1,000 fractured prisms, creating the illusion that they were walking through the interior of a massive geode. But it was the air that immediately affected them. It was humid, yes, but more than that, it was dense, pressing against their eardrums with a subtle but insistent pressure, as if the cave system existed at a different atmospheric density than the world above. Yuki Tanaka checked her altimeter and frowned. "The pressure readings don't make sense," she muttered, tapping the device with a fingernail painted in chipped black lacquer. "We're only 200 meters below the surface. It should feel like the surface. This feels like we're a kilometer down." Ian, who had begun to move into the tunnel, did not look back. "The air is old here," he said. "It has weight. The deeper we go, the heavier it becomes. The mountain remembers everything it has swallowed, and the memory presses down." They made camp in the first chamber, a cathedral-like space where the salt deposits had formed massive, translucent columns that resembled frozen waterfalls of glass. As they ate their prepackaged meals and checked their equipment, Ian sat apart from the group, his lamp turned low, his face lost in shadow except for the glowing ember of his cigarette. Armin approached him, driven by a need to understand the warnings that the guide had been murmuring since their departure. "Tell me about the Balaur," Armin said, sitting on a salt-encrusted boulder that felt wrong beneath him, too warm, almost pulsing with a faint thermal rhythm. Ian exhaled a stream of smoke that did not dissipate normally, but instead seemed to sink toward the floor, pooling in the crevices like a liquid. "The Balaur is not a dragon like in your storybooks," Ian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to travel through the crystalline walls, resonating in frequencies that made Armin's teeth ache. "It begins as a snake, small, blind, white as bone. It finds a deep place, a dark place, a place where the silence is absolute, and then it waits. It does not hunt. It does not eat. It simply exists in the stillness. And for every year that passes in that silence, for every year that no voice disturbs it, no footstep offends it, no light penetrates its sanctuary, it grows. Not like a tree grows, not like a child grows. It aggregates. It adds. A new head for every year of perfect, uninterrupted silence." Armin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's ambient temperature. "How many heads?" he asked, the academic in him demanding specifics even as his instincts recoiled from the answer. Ian turned to look at him, and in the dim light the guide's eyes seemed to have lost their pupils, becoming reflective pools like those of a nocturnal predator. "The old stories say 7, Ian whispered. "But the old stories are from the time when the world was loud, when villages were close and mines were shallow. The world has grown quieter now. People have moved to the cities. The deep places have been left alone for longer than ever before." He paused, and the silence that followed was so absolute that Armin could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, a susurrus that suddenly seemed dangerously loud. "We have given it centuries of silence," Ian said, "and it has been counting every second." The second day of the descent took them through a transition zone where the salt deposits gave way to basaltic formations. The volcanic rock extruded from ancient fissures in the Earth's crust. The temperature began to rise steadily, and the heavy air grew saturated with the smell of sulfur and something else, something organic and ancient, like the breath of a carnivore that had been hibernating since the Miocene. The specialists remained in high spirits, their geological readings indicating the presence of rare mineral formations that could only form in the unique conditions of deep hydrothermal vents. They talked about markets and valuations, about auction houses in Geneva and private collectors in Dubai who would pay fortunes for specimens of prehistorically preserved gemstones. They did not notice that the cave system was changing around them, the natural formations giving way to structures that seemed too regular, too intentional, as if the stone itself had been worked by hands or claws that understood architecture. Armin noticed. He noticed the way the basalt columns aligned in patterns that suggested corridors rather than random geological formations. He noticed the way the floor had been smoothed by something massive dragging itself across the stone over millennia. He noticed the way the darkness ahead of them seemed to possess a texture, a density, that darkness should not have. It was on the morning of the third day that they found the first chamber of treasures, and it was this discovery that sealed their fates with the irrevocable certainty of a contract signed in blood. They had descended through a vertical shaft that required rappelling equipment, dropping 40 meters into a vaulted space that their headlamps could not fully illuminate. As the beams swept across the walls, Maggie Chevalier, the speleologist, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The chamber was filled with formations that looked like crystals, but were not crystals, translucent structures that rose from the floor and descended from the ceiling in massive, convoluted shapes that caught the light and refracted it into spectra that had no names in the visible range. They were mesmerizing, these formations, pulsing with an inner luminescence that seemed to sync with the human heartbeat, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made it difficult to look away. Yuki Tanaka scrambled down the rope with a speed that bordered on recklessness, her spectrometer already humming. "This is impossible," she breathed, running the device over a formation the size of a human torso. The molecular structure is crystalline but organic. It's like something secreted this and then it mineralized, like saliva, like resin. Armin, who had been examining a smaller formation near the chamber's edge, felt his blood freeze. He touched the surface of the structure, feeling its slick, almost wet texture beneath his fingertips, and he understood with a clarity that made him want to scream. "Ian," he called, his voice trembling. "What is this?" The guide stood in the entrance to the chamber, his face illuminated by the unearthly glow of the formations, and his expression was one of absolute transcendent horror. "The lure," Ian said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the equipment. "The Balaur does not eat meat. It does not eat plants. It eats time. It eats stillness. But to grow, it needs stimulation. It needs the disturbance. The gold, the gems, the treasures, they are the bait. They are the reason the greedy come. They are the reason the silence is broken. And when the silence is broken—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because at that moment Dieter Voss, the more impulsive of the Austrian twins, laughed, a loud, booming sound of pure capitalist delight, and slammed his pickaxe into one of the formations, shattering it into 1,000 luminescent fragments. The sound was catastrophic in the enclosed space, a percussive blast that seemed to travel not just through the air but through the stone itself, rippling outward in concentric waves that Armin could feel in his sternum. And in the aftermath of that sound, in the heavy, expectant silence that followed, they all heard it. A shifting. A massive, stone-on-stone grinding from the depths of the cave system, from the direction they had not yet explored, from the dark places where the light had never reached. Something was moving. Something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of noise, exactly this kind of interruption, exactly this kind of sacrifice to its endless, ravenous hunger for the one thing that the surface world could offer, the breaking of silence, and the years that came with it. Armin turned to Ian, his face a mask of dawning comprehension, and he saw in the guide's eyes the reflection of something that had just emerged from the farthest corner of the chamber, something that was not illuminated by their lights because it seemed to absorb illumination, something whose neck was unspooling in the darkness like a nightmare given permission to exist. And Armin understood, finally and irrevocably, that they were not explorers. They were not scientists. They were not treasure hunters. They were deliveries. They were the stimulus package that the creature had been waiting centuries to receive. The first head emerged from the shadow, and it was not like anything in the fossil record, not like anything in myth or legend. It was a functional instrument of predation, its jaws unhinging to reveal not a throat but a compression chamber, and from that chamber issued a sound that was not a roar but a vacuum, a suction so powerful that Armin felt the air being drawn from his lungs. The second head appeared beside it, and then the third, each one emerging from a central mass that remained hidden in the absolute dark, each one positioned with geometric precision to block the exits, to secure the perimeter, to ensure that the delivery would not escape before the payment. The years, the precious, accumulated years, could be extracted in full. And Armin Voss, paleontologist, disgraced academic, desperate fool, opened his mouth to scream the warning that his rational mind had finally, in the last moments of his life, fully understood. It didn't want the gold, you idiots, it wanted the years. But the scream was swallowed by the cave, and by the thing that was the cave, and by the endless, counting silence that had finally found its voice. The first head did not strike immediately, and this delay was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the initial encounter, for it demonstrated that the creature was not operating on the simple, reactive impulses of a normal predator, but on a calculus of terror that had been refined over geological epochs. The head, the one that had emerged closest to Dieter Voss, who stood frozen with his pickaxe still raised in a posture of aborted triumph, hovered in the air approximately 3 meters above the cavern floor, suspended on that impossibly elongated neck, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, reflecting the lamplight not as illumination but as a kind of digestive contemplation. The eyes were multifaceted, not in the manner of an insect's compound vision, but in the manner of a kaleidoscope that had been filled with liquid mercury, each surface shifting and reconfiguring to track not just movement but intention. The head tilted, a gesture of almost avian curiosity, and then it opened its jaws wide, wider than the structural limits of bone should have permitted, revealing the compression chamber that Yuki Tanaka would later describe, in the fleeting moments before her own death, as resembling the interior of a jet engine designed by a deity with no regard for the welfare of its creations. The sound that emerged was not fire, though the myths had always spoken of dragons breathing flame. It was something far worse, something that exploited the very physics of the cave environment to create a weapon of devastating efficiency. The Balaur exhaled a pressurized stream of caustic gas, a cocktail of volcanic vapors and biosynthesized compounds that had been percolating in the compression chambers of its multiple throats for centuries, refined by the creature's unique metabolic processes into a substance that existed at the boundary between liquid and gas. The stream struck Dieter Voss not with heat but with corrosive mass, a jet of fluid so dense and so chemically aggressive that it did not merely burn his skin, it dissolved it, stripping away the epidermis in milliseconds, then attacking the dermis, then reaching the subcutaneous tissues with the eager hunger of a solvent encountering its ideal solute. Dieter did not scream for long. The gas entered his lungs with the same efficiency, flooding the alveoli and converting the moist tissues into a froth of denatured proteins that bubbled from his mouth and nostrils in a pink, frothy eruption. He collapsed, his body continuing to dissolve even as it fell, the caustic agent pooling around his remains and beginning to etch the limestone floor with a sibilance that sounded almost satisfied. The reaction of the remaining team members was a study in the various ways human beings respond to the sudden, undeniable presence of the impossible. Franz Voss, Dieter's twin, emitted a sound that was not quite a word and not quite an animal vocalization, a primal rejection of the reality before him, and he lunged toward his brother's dissolving corpse with an instinct that overrode his survival programming. Kellerman, the mercenary, reacted with the conditioned reflexes of his training, bringing his sidearm to bear and firing 3 shots in rapid succession at the nearest head, the reports thunderous in the enclosed space, the muzzle flashes strobing against the crystalline walls in a staccato of brief, violent illumination. Maggie Chevalier dropped to a crouch, her speleological instincts preserving her life for a few additional seconds as she recognized that standing made one a target. Yuki Tanaka stood frozen, her spectrometer still humming in her hand, her mouth open in an expression of scientific rapture that had not yet had time to convert to horror. And Armin Voss, Armin who had studied the fossils, who had theorized the aggregation, who had dreamed of this moment in the abstract language of academic papers and conference presentations, Armin understood with a clarity that felt like a religious conversion that the creature was not attacking them randomly. It was selecting. It was prioritizing. The head that had killed Dieter was already withdrawing, its neck coiling with sinuous precision, while a second head was extending toward Franz Voss, who knelt weeping in the pool of his brother's remains. The first head had claimed the loudest, the most disruptive, the one whose greed had shattered the silence. The second head would claim the next most obvious target. And the others were waiting, positioned at the chamber's perimeter like sentinels at the gates of a fortress, ensuring that the prey could not scatter. "The heads," Ian shouted, his voice cutting through the panic with a terrible authority. "They act alone. It's not one mind, it's a committee. Block the exits." But his warning came too late, or perhaps it had always been too late. Perhaps the moment they entered the cave system they had entered a body, a digestive tract, a mechanism designed to process intruders with the same mechanical indifference that a spider's web processes flies. The second head struck Franz Voss not with the corrosive breath but with physical force, the massive skull, each one the size of a compact car, Armin's academic mind noted with insane precision, sweeping down and sideways, catching the Austrian twin in the ribs and launching him across the chamber. France struck a formation of the mineralized saliva gems with a wet, organic crunch, his spine snapping audibly, his body folding around the crystalline structure in a parody of embrace. The head did not follow up with a killing blow. It did not need to. Franz Voss was no longer a threat, no longer a runner, no longer a variable in the equation of escape. He was a wounded animal, moaning and twitching, and the Balaur understood, if understanding was the right word for whatever cognitive process drove the distributed nervous system of a creature that had never been meant to exist, that wounded prey made excellent bait. The head withdrew, its neck retracting into the darkness from which it had emerged, and Armin saw with sickening certainty that the darkness itself was not empty. The darkness was the creature. The darkness was the other heads, the central mass, the accumulated centuries of growth that had transformed a simple serpent into a biological megastructure that spanned caverns, that was built into the architecture of the mountain itself. Kellerman's shots had found their mark, or at least they had struck the target. 2 of the rounds had impacted the scales of the nearest head, creating sparks and a sound like hammers striking an anvil. The head had flinched, a reflexive withdrawal of perhaps half a meter, and Kellerman seized on this reaction with the desperate optimism of a man who has spent his life believing that violence is the universal solution. "It's vulnerable," he screamed, ejecting his spent magazine and slamming home a fresh one with practiced efficiency. "Aim for the eyes. Concentrate fire." He opened up with sustained automatic fire, the reports merging into a continuous roar that filled the chamber with noise and smoke and the acrid stench of cordite. The other specialists, galvanized by his example, reached for their own weapons, Yuki dropping her spectrometer and drawing a compact pistol from her belt, Maggie producing a flare gun from her climbing pack, the remaining team members grabbing anything that could serve as a weapon. They fired into the darkness, into the mass of coiling necks and shifting scales, and for a moment it seemed as if they might be holding their own, as if human ingenuity and firepower might triumph over the ancient, accumulated nightmare that had been waiting in the dark. But the noise was the fatal error, the miscalculation that transformed a controlled slaughter into an absolute massacre. Armin understood it even as it happened, even as he pressed himself against the salt-encrusted wall, and felt the stone itself seem to shiver with a vibration that was not seismic but biological. The Balaur did not fear noise. The Balaur craved noise. Every sound, every report, every scream, every panicked breath was a stimulus, a data point, a morsel of disturbance that fed the creature's hunger for the very thing it had been deprived of for centuries. And more than that, the noise traveled. It traveled through the cave system, through the volcanic vents, through the limestone arteries that connected this chamber to deeper, darker chambers where other heads waited, where other segments of the committee slumbered in the absolute stillness that was both their natural habitat and their sustenance. The gunfire was not a deterrent. It was an invitation. It was a summons. It was the dinner bell that Ian had warned them about, not in the metaphorical sense but in the literal, physiological sense. The creature had evolved, or aggregated, or accumulated, to respond to sound as the primary indicator of prey availability, and the sustained cacophony of Kellerman's assault rifle was the equivalent of 1,000 years of normal cave disturbance compressed into 30 seconds of relentless, glorious, fatal stimulation. The 4th head emerged from a crevice in the ceiling that none of them had noticed, a crevice that had blended seamlessly into the shadowed architecture of the chamber, until the scales began to shift, and the stone-like texture resolved into the flexing musculature of another neck unspooling downward. This head was different from the others. Where the first 2 had exhibited a kind of predatory focus, a direct and immediate engagement with the nearest targets, this head moved with a deliberation that suggested a different function within the committee. It did not strike at the shooters. It did not breathe its caustic payload. Instead, it swept across the chamber in a wide, horizontal arc, its skull impacting the ceiling with a force that dislodged massive stalactites of salt and mineralized secretion, sending them crashing to the floor in a bombardment that transformed the space into a killing field of falling stone. Maggie Chevalier, who had been preparing to fire her flare gun, was struck by a falling formation the size of a human thigh. The impact drove her to her knees, her left arm pulverized, the flare gun spinning away into the darkness. She did not scream. The shock was too complete, the pain too overwhelming to process into sound. She simply stared at the ruin of her arm with an expression of puzzled betrayal, as if her own body had played a trick on her. And then the fifth head appeared, and the sixth, and Armin lost count because the geometry of the chamber had ceased to make sense, the space reconfiguring itself around the emergence of the creature's multiple extremities. He understood now, with the terrible clarity of a man drowning in freezing water, what Ian had meant when he said the beast was the environment. They had not entered a cave. They had entered a digestive system. The walls were not walls, they were the creature's flanks, scaled and armored, pressed against the limestone by the sheer bulk of the central mass. The floor was not floor, it was the creature's ventral surface, flexing and shifting with the slow respiration of something that metabolized silence and exhaled anticipation. The crystals they had admired, the treasures they had lusted after, they were secretions, lure elements, bait drops placed at strategic locations to attract the greedy and the curious, to bring them deep enough that the committee could engage without the risk of escape. The Balaur was not hunting them. It was harvesting them, and the harvest had been planned since before they had left Cluj-Napoca, since before they had been born, since before the first human had walked the Carpathian passes and wondered about the strange lights seen deep in the mountain crevices at night. Yuki Tanaka died next, and her death was the most horrific because it was the most intimate. One of the heads, Armin could no longer distinguish them by number, could no longer maintain the cognitive distance necessary for taxonomy, approached her with a slowness that was almost tender, its mercury eyes reflecting her face in distorted miniature. She had stopped firing her pistol, the slide locked back on an empty magazine, and she stood with her arms at her sides, her body swaying slightly in a posture that might have been resignation or might have been some hypnotic effect of the creature's gaze. The head descended until its jaws were level with her face, and it opened them not wide but precisely, with surgical exactitude, and it exhaled not the caustic stream but a single puff of concentrated vapor, a directed dose of the gas that acted not as a corrosive but as a preservative, freezing the mucous membranes of her eyes and nostrils in an instant, paralyzing the cranial nerves, rendering her conscious but immobile. The head then gripped her skull between its jaws, not crushing but holding, positioning, and Armin watched in paralyzed horror as the creature's throat pulsed with a peristaltic rhythm, and Yuki's face began to change. Not to dissolve, not to burn, but to age. The skin sagged, the hair whitened and fell out, the eyes clouded with cataracts that formed and thickened in seconds. The Balaur was extracting something, drinking something, metabolizing the temporal signature of her biology, consuming the years that remained in her cellular structure, converting the potential energy of her future into the kinetic energy of its own growth. When the head released her, she crumpled, a desiccated husk of 90 years contained in a body that had been young and vital moments before, and the creature's neck lengthened almost imperceptibly, adding another fraction of a meter to its impossible reach, another increment to its accumulated span. "Stop firing," Ian was screaming, his voice raw and desperate, his hands pressed over his ears as if he could somehow filter out the violence of the noise. "You're feeding it. Every sound makes it stronger. Every scream gives it more." But Kellerman could not stop. Kellerman was a man whose identity was constructed around the axis of controlled violence, who had survived a dozen war zones by the simple expedient of being the most aggressive party in any engagement. and the realization that his primary survival strategy was not just ineffective but actively counterproductive, was a cognitive dissonance that his psyche could not accommodate. He emptied his magazine into the nearest head, the rounds sparking off the armored scales, the reports echoing and re-echoing until the chamber itself seemed to be vibrating with the frequency of his denial. And the Balaur responded not with pain but with expansion. The heads multiplied in Armin's perception, or perhaps they were simply emerging from the shadows that had concealed them, the committee convening in full session to process the unprecedented bounty of stimulation that Kellerman's panic was providing. The seventh head emerged, and then the eighth, each one taking up a position of geometric efficiency, blocking the exits, securing the perimeter, dividing the chamber into smaller and smaller pockets of accessible space. The brutality of the attrition was not just physical but spatial. The creature did not merely kill, it constricted. It used its bulk, its impossible mass accumulated over centuries of isolation, to reshape the environment in real time, collapsing tunnels, sealing crevices, creating a labyrinth of falling stone and shifting scale that drove the survivors into ever smaller zones of safety. Armin found himself crawling through a space that had been a corridor moments before, but was now a tunnel barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders. The walls on either side not stone but the warm, flexing scales of the creature's flank. The air thick with the smell of sulfur and the strange, sweet odor of the mineralized secretions. He could hear Kellerman somewhere behind him, still firing, still screaming, and then the sound of the mercenary's voice changed pitch, transformed from rage into a gurgling, choking terror that suggested the caustic gas had found him. Or perhaps one of the heads had simply bitten down, using the mechanical advantage of jaws designed to process the hardest materials the earth could offer. The sound of the gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was not empty but full, pregnant with the satisfied stillness of a predator that has consumed its fill and now waits, patiently, for the digestion to complete. Armin crawled onward, his hands bleeding from the sharp edges of salt crystals, his knees bruised against the stone, his mind a white-hot core of terror that had burned away all pretense of scientific curiosity or academic ambition. He was no longer Dr. Armin Voss, paleontologist. He was a mammal trapped in a digestive system, a piece of biomass trying to navigate a space that had been designed to process biomass. And ahead of him, in the darkness that his headlamp could not fully penetrate, he heard the sound of something breathing. Not the breathing of lungs, the Balaur did not seem to respire in the normal sense, but the breathing of a mountain, the slow exhalation of geological time given biological expression, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the Earth's mantle. The ninth head was extending toward him, he realized, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting at the end of this narrowing corridor, waiting for him to crawl close enough that the final transaction could be completed. The years. It wanted the years, not the gold, not the gems, not the material wealth that had drawn them into this trap. It wanted the temporal substance of their lives, the accumulated potential of their futures, the silence that they would never again disturb because they would be part of the silence, absorbed into the committee, converted into the endless, counting stillness of the deep earth. Armin, the voice was Ian's, close behind him, the guide's hand closing on his ankle with a grip that was painful in its urgency. This way, there's a fissure, move. And Armin, who had forgotten that other humans existed, who had been alone with the creature in a communion of terror that transcended social connection, felt a jolt of impossible hope. He crawled faster, Ian's hand guiding his foot, pressing him toward a gap in the scales that revealed not more darkness but a glimmer of something else, something that might have been reflected lamplight from a different angle, a different chamber, a space that the committee had not yet fully occupied. They squeezed through the fissure, their bodies scraping against the edges of scales that felt like warm ceramic, like heated porcelain, like the surface of something that had been baked in the earth's own kiln. They emerged into a smaller chamber, a pocket of space barely large enough for the two of them to stand, and Ian immediately clamped his hand over Armin's mouth, pressing his lips against the paleontologist's ear with a ferocity that conveyed more than words ever could. "Silence," Ian breathed, the word barely a movement of air. "Absolute silence. It counts the quiet. It grows in the quiet, but it also hunts in the noise. If we are silent, we are not interesting. If we are not interesting, we are not priority." Armin nodded, his whole body trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs with a percussion that he feared the creature could hear, could track, could count as a beat in the symphony of stimuli that drove its predatory algorithms. They crouched in the darkness, two men reduced to the status of rodents in a burrow, and listened to the sounds of the Balaur processing the remaining members of their expedition. The sounds were not the sounds of feeding, not the wet tearing of flesh or the crunch of bone. They were the sounds of conversion, of absorption, of the creature's multiple throats working in synchronized peristalsis to extract the temporal essence from the bodies it had collected. Armin could hear the low, rhythmic rumble of the central mass, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the geological equivalent of a contented purr. He thought of Yuki Tanaka's face aging decades in seconds, of Dieter Voss dissolving in a caustic bath, of Franz Voss folding around the crystal formation like a broken doll. He thought of the years that the creature had accumulated, the centuries of heads added one by one, the millennia of silence that had been disturbed by their greed and their noise. And he understood, with a clarity that made him want to weep and laugh simultaneously, that the creature was not evil. The creature was not malevolent. The creature was simply doing what it had been designed to do by the blind process of its own impossible existence. It was growing, aggregating, accumulating, converting the one resource that the surface world possessed in abundance, the noisy, chaotic, stimulation-rich existence of sentient beings, into the silent, still, perfect stasis of the deep earth. The minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps the hours stretched into minutes. Time had become as unreliable as space in the belly of the beast, and Armin felt his consciousness beginning to fray at the edges, the sustained terror giving way to a kind of hallucinatory clarity in which the walls of the chamber seemed to breathe with him, in which the darkness developed textures that he could almost read like Braille. Ian remained motionless beside him, a statue of patience and fear, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow and controlled that Armin had to watch the rise and fall of his chest to confirm that he was still alive. They communicated without sound, without gesture, through the shared osmosis of their terror, and Armin understood that Ian had been here before, or somewhere like here, that the guide's knowledge was not folkloric but experiential, the inherited trauma of a lineage that had learned to survive in the shadow of the Balaur by becoming part of the silence, by learning to count the quiet alongside the creature itself. The thought was almost comforting. They were not alone in their fear. They were part of a tradition of fear, a continuous thread of human terror that stretched back through the generations, each survivor adding their own layer of cautionary wisdom to the accumulated lore. But comfort was a luxury that the cave did not permit for long. The sound began as a subtle shift in the ambient pressure, an increase in the weight of the air that Ian had warned them about, and it grew steadily into a physical force that pressed against their eardrums and squeezed the breath from their lungs. The Balaur was moving again, or perhaps it had never stopped moving. Perhaps its stillness was an illusion maintained by the creature's ability to integrate its own motion into the background vibration of the earth. The scales that formed the wall of their hiding place began to flex, to ripple, and Armin realized with fresh horror that the chamber they had entered was not a separate space, but a fold in the creature's own anatomy, a pocket formed by the looping of one of its many necks, a space that existed only at the creature's sufferance and could be collapsed at any moment. The committee was reconvening, the multiple heads resuming their coordinated activity, and the two survivors were no longer hidden but merely overlooked, temporarily set aside, while the larger meal was processed, soon to be recalled to the attention of the distributed intelligence that governed the whole. "It knows we're here," Ian mouthed, the words visible rather than audible in the dim glow of Armin's dying headlamp. "It always knows. It is deciding." Armin stared at him, his eyes wide with a question he dared not voice. Deciding what? Deciding whether to kill them now or later. Deciding whether they had enough years left to be worth the expenditure of energy. Or deciding something else, something that transcended the simple binary of predator and prey, something that touched on the creature's ultimate purpose in the ecology of the deep earth. Ian met his gaze with an expression of infinite sadness, and Armin saw in that expression the answer to his unspoken question. The Balaur was not deciding whether to kill them. It was deciding how to use them. They were not food, not entirely. They were messengers. They were bait for the next group. They were the seeds of future harvests, the carriers of the lure, the living advertisements for the gold that waited in the dark, whispering to the surface world in the language of greed and curiosity, and the eternal human conviction that the earth's secrets could be conquered by those brave enough, or foolish enough, to seek them out. The wall of scales began to retract, the fold in the creature's anatomy slowly unrolling to reveal the chamber beyond, and Armin felt the first touch of the Balaur's attention returning to them, not as a physical sensation, but as a kind of psychic pressure, a weight on his mind that matched the weight on his lungs. The ninth head was there, hovering in the newly opened space, its mercury eyes fixed upon him with an expression that he could only describe as expectation. It did not attack. It waited. And in that waiting, Armin understood the final horror of the creature's design, the ultimate refinement of its predatory strategy. It did not need to chase them. It did not need to fight them. It needed only to be known, to be witnessed, to be remembered by those who escaped, so that the legend would continue, so that the lure would remain active, so that the silence would be broken again and again and again, each time providing the stimulus necessary for another cycle of growth, another head, another century of accumulation. The gold was real. The gems were real. The treasure existed, not as a deception but as a partnership, a symbiosis between the mineral and the biological, the bait and the trap, the dream and the nightmare that consumed the dreamers. "We have to move," Ian whispered, the words barely audible above the rumble of the creature's shifting mass. "Slowly, quietly, don't look at the heads, don't make eye contact. It interprets attention as stimulation. We are uninteresting, we are not here. We are part of the silence." He began to crawl, not toward the ninth head but along the perimeter of the chamber, his body pressed against the cold stone, his movements so gradual and controlled that they seemed to be happening in a different temporal frame than the rest of reality. Armin followed, his muscles screaming in protest, his joints aching from the sustained tension of crouched movement, his mind a blank canvas onto which the terror painted itself in ever more vivid strokes. They passed beneath the ninth head, close enough that Armin could smell the creature's breath, a mixture of sulfur and petrichor and something else, something that reminded him of the smell of old books in a library that had been closed for centuries, the smell of preserved knowledge and accumulated time. The head did not turn to follow them. The mercury eyes did not track their movement, and Armin realized that Ian was right. The creature was not interested in them at this moment because they were not providing the stimulus that the creature craved. They were silent. They were small. They were, in the calculus of the committee, temporarily irrelevant. But irrelevance was a fragile shield, and it shattered with the sudden, unexpected sound of a human voice, cracked and desperate, echoing from a tunnel to their left. "Help me! Oh God, someone help me!" It was Maggie Chevalier. She was still alive somehow, her shattered arm dragging behind her, her face a mask of blood and salt dust, her eyes wild with the terror of a woman who had seen the committee at work and had retained enough consciousness to fear what came next. She had found them, or they had found her, or the creature had arranged for them to find each other, the predator's generosity of allowing the prey to cluster before the final cull. Her voice was a sonic beacon, a lighthouse of disturbance in the sea of silence, and Armin felt the immediate shift in the creature's attention as every head in the vicinity turned toward the source of the sound, the mercury eyes refocusing, the jaws beginning to open in synchronized preparation. "No," Ian shouted, the word escaping his control, his horror at the disruption overriding his training. "Don't move, don't speak." But it was too late. The committee had made its decision. The harvest would resume. Maggie Chevalier's scream did not last long, but in the compressed, terrified temporality of the cave, it seemed to extend across an infinity of echoing vibrations, each reflection of her voice bouncing off the crystalline walls and feeding back into the creature's distributed sensorium like a sonic feast laid before a glutton. The nearest head, the fourth, Armin thought, or perhaps the fifth, his capacity for enumeration having collapsed under the weight of the impossible, struck with a speed that contradicted its massive bulk, the skull descending in a blurred arc that terminated in the speleologist's midsection with a wet, hollow impact. The sound was not the crunch of bone that Armin had expected, but rather a slap, a meaty, visceral thud that suggested the creature was not biting her but swatting her, batting her like a cat playing with a wounded bird, preserving the body for the more refined extraction that would follow. Maggie's body sailed across the chamber and struck the far wall, leaving a streak of blood and tissue on the salt-encrusted stone, and then she slid to the floor, still moving, still conscious, her eyes rolling in their sockets as she tried to comprehend the damage that had been done to her. She had been disemboweled, Armin realized with the detached horror of a man whose emotional circuits had been overloaded beyond the point of normal response. The head's impact had not merely broken her ribs. It had driven them inward with such force that they had sliced through the abdominal wall, and her intestines were now spilling across the cavern floor in a steaming, coiled mass that glistened in the dim light like the mineralized secretions they had so admired only hours before. But the Balaur did not consume her immediately. The head withdrew, its neck coiling with sinuous patience, and Armin watched in sick fascination as the creature's behavior revealed another layer of its predatory sophistication. It was waiting for her to scream again. It was waiting for the survivors to react, to shout, to rush to her aid, to provide the stimulus that justified the expenditure of energy required for her final processing. The committee did not waste motion. It did not waste time. Every action was calculated against the return of disturbance, the currency of sound and fear and desperate human noise that fueled its growth. Maggie, lying in her own viscera, understood this too, or perhaps she simply understood that screaming would accomplish nothing but attracting the next blow. She pressed her one functioning hand against the ruin of her abdomen and bit down on her own lip until blood ran from her mouth, stifling the screams that must have been building in her throat, choking them back with a willpower that was almost superhuman. Her eyes, wide and glassy with shock, found Armin's across the chamber, and in that glance passed a communication more eloquent than any spoken word. "Don't come. Don't make noise. Let me be the lesson. Let my silence be the price of your escape." Armin felt Ian's hand clamp down on his wrist with crushing force, the guide's fingers digging into the paleontologist's flesh with a silent warning that penetrated the fog of his panic. They were crouched in the partial concealment of a salt formation, their bodies pressed into a recess that offered no real protection, but at least broke up their silhouettes against the crystalline background. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the three survivors, Armin, Ian, and the dying Maggie, locked in a triangle of mutual awareness while the Balaur's multiple heads wove patterns in the air above them, searching, listening, counting the quality of the silence. And then, from the depths of the cave system, came a sound that made Armin's soul shrink within his body, the grinding, clicking, extending sound of another neck unspooling, another head emerging from the central mass to join the committee. The ninth head, which had been the most recent addition when they arrived, was now being joined by a 10th. The creature was still growing. Even in the midst of the hunt, Even while processing its current harvest, the Balaur continued to aggregate, converting the disturbance they had provided into new physical mass, new predatory capacity, new reach. The implications were staggering. The creature was not merely defending its territory. It was farming. It was cultivating the stimulus, maximizing the yield, ensuring that each intrusion resulted in a net gain of heads, of years, of accumulated silence that could only be purchased with the currency of human terror. The fisher, Ian breathed into Armin's ear, the words so soft they were almost indistinguishable from the ambient rumble of the creature's mass. To the left, a natural chimney. It leads up, maybe to the surface, maybe to a dead end. But it is the only way that is not blocked. Armin turned his head with agonizing slowness, following Ian's gaze to a narrow vertical crack in the chamber wall, a dark line that promised ascent, that suggested the possibility of vertical escape from the horizontal trap they had entered. But the crack was on the far side of the chamber, separated from them by 10 meters of open space that was currently being patrolled by 3 of the Balaur's heads, each one moving with the lazy, circling precision of a shark in a tank that has grown too small for its inhabitants. To reach the fisher, they would have to cross that open space. They would have to move. And movement in the perceptual field of the committee was merely another form of noise, another disturbance to be counted and processed. Maggie, Armin mouthed, the name forming on his lips without sound. Ian shook his head, the gesture infinitesimal but absolute. There was no saving her. There was no reaching her. To try would be to trigger the final phase of the hunt, to convert the suspended animation of the creature's waiting into the kinetic frenzy of its feeding. Maggie understood this. Even in her delirium, even as her blood pooled around her and her consciousness flickered like a candle in a hurricane, she understood that her role had changed from survivor to bait, from prey to lure. She was the sacrifice that would buy the others time, and she accepted this with a stoicism that Armin would carry with him for the rest of his life, however long or short that life might prove to be. She closed her eyes. She let her hand fall away from her wound, and she became still. Not the stillness of death, not yet, but the stillness of surrender, of a woman who had given everything she had to give and now waited for the darkness to complete its work. The Balaur noticed. The committee could not fail to notice. The cessation of movement, the silence where there had been the wet sound of labored breathing, the stillness where there had been the twitching of terminal nerve impulses. These registered as data points in the creature's distributed awareness, and the response was not immediate attack, but rather a kind of predatory confusion. The head circled closer, the mercury eyes scanning the body with the puzzled scrutiny of a collector examining a specimen that had ceased to be interesting. The 10th head, newly extended, approached Maggie with a hesitancy that seemed almost tender, its jaws opening and closing in a testing motion, as if unsure whether to process this source of diminished stimulus or to seek more vibrant prey. And in that moment of hesitation, Ian moved. He did not run. Running would have been fatal, the impact of footfalls on stone translating directly into the acoustic profile that the creature used to track its targets. He flowed, his body becoming liquid, his movements synchronized with the ambient rumble of the cave's natural settling, his steps placed in the microsecond pauses between the creature's own rhythmic pulsations. He was a shadow given intention, a ghost of movement that existed in the negative space of the Balaur's perception, and Armin, watching him, understood that this was the true knowledge of the guide's lineage, the inherited art of moving through spaces dominated by the committee without registering as a distinct signal. It was not magic. It was not supernatural. It was simply the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to survive by becoming part of the background noise, by subtracting themselves from the equation of predator and prey. Armin tried to follow. He tried to replicate Ian's liquid grace, to dissolve his own terror into the rhythm of the cave, but his body betrayed him. His muscles, cramped from hours of crouched stillness, spasmed as he shifted his weight, his knee knocking against a salt crystal with a sound that was not loud in absolute terms, but was catastrophically distinct in the relative silence of the chamber. The sound was a chime, a crystalline ping that rang out like a dinner bell, and every head in the vicinity snapped toward its source with the synchronized precision of a military unit responding to a command. Armin felt the weight of their attention, the physical pressure of multiple predatory intelligences focusing on his position, with an intensity that seemed to compress the air around him, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to move. He was pinned not by teeth or claws, but by the sheer psychic mass of the creature's regard, held in place by the certainty that any movement would be the last movement he ever made. But Ian had reached the fissure. The guide was already wedging his body into the vertical crack, his shoulders scraping against the narrow walls, his feet finding purchase on invisible ledges, his hands reaching up into the darkness above. He paused, looking back at Armin with an expression that contained no hope, no encouragement, only the stark mathematics of survival. One of them could make it, or neither of them could make it, but two of them could not make it together if one of them had already been marked by the committee. The message was clear. Armin was the sacrifice now. Armin was the distraction. Armin was the price of Ian's escape, just as Maggie had been the price of their attempted crossing. "No," Armin whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it, a single syllable of defiance that rang through the chamber like a thunderclap. And the Balaur responded. The nearest head, the second, the one that had killed Dieter Voss with its caustic breath, unhinged its jaws and exhaled not a stream but a cloud, a diffused atmospheric weapon that expanded outward in a rolling wave of chemical aggression. Armin threw himself backward, his body slamming against the salt wall, and he felt the edge of the cloud pass over him, the caustic mist settling on his exposed skin with a tingling that was not yet pain, but was the promise of pain, the prelude to dissolution. He screamed, unable to contain the terror any longer, and his scream was the final contribution he made to the creature's feast, the ultimate stimulus that purchased Ian precious seconds of inattention. The guide scrambled upward, his body disappearing into the fissure, his boots kicking loose salt crystals that rained down into the chamber like a mocking parody of the treasure they had come to steal. Armin, meanwhile, was crawling, his skin beginning to blister where the caustic cloud had touched him, his eyes streaming tears that blurred his vision into an impressionistic smear of crystalline light and shadow. He crawled toward Maggie, not because he could save her but because he could not bear to die alone, because the proximity of another human being, even a dying one, was the last comfort available to him in the absolute darkness of the committee's domain. He reached her side and pressed his face against her shoulder, feeling the wet warmth of her blood soaking into his shirt, smelling the copper and salt odor of her exposed viscera, and he whispered, "I'm sorry," into her ear, not sure if she could hear him, not sure if she was still alive, not sure if anything he said mattered anymore. The heads descended, not one but three, converging on their position with the deliberate choreography of a surgical team approaching an operating table. Armin closed his eyes and tried to think of his daughter, of her face in the photograph he carried in his wallet, of the last time he had seen her before his obsession with the Balaur had driven his family away. He tried to think of sunlight, of grass, of the sound of birds singing in trees that were not made of salt and stone. He tried to think of anything but the grinding approach of the committee, the wet click of jaws unhinging, the pressure of the air changing as the massive skulls displaced it with their approach. And then, just as he felt the first touch of the creature's breath against his face, not caustic this time but warm, almost comforting like the breath of a sleeping giant, he heard a sound that made no sense. A sound from above, a human sound, a voice shouting not in terror but in defiance, in challenge, in the deliberate manufacture of maximum disturbance. It was Ian. The guide had not escaped. The guide had climbed to a ledge, a protrusion in the chimney of the fissure, and he was shouting, screaming, cursing in Romanian and Hungarian and languages older than either, his voice echoing through the cave system with a volume and intensity that dwarfed anything the expedition had produced before. He was throwing rocks, kicking debris, creating a cacophony of percussion that seemed to shake the very stone around them. And the Balaur, the committee, the distributed intelligence that had been processing Armin and Maggie as its next course, it turned. All of it, every head, every neck, every accumulated century of predatory focus, turned toward the source of this unprecedented stimulation. Because Ian was not merely making noise. Ian was making interesting noise. He was making noise that suggested survival, escape, defiance. The kinds of noise that promised future disturbance, future harvests, future years. And the creature, in its infinite patience, in its geological timescale of predation, understood that the long game was more valuable than the immediate meal. Armin watched through blurred eyes as the heads retracted from his position, their necks uncoiling and extending upward toward the fissure where Ian continued his suicidal symphony of sound. He watched as the 10th head, the newest, the most eager, lunged toward the crack with a speed that suggested hunger rather than strategy, its jaws snapping at empty air where Ian had been moments before. And he watched as Ian, the guide, the survivor, the keeper of the silence, let himself fall backward into the chimney, dropping into the darkness below with a grace that suggested he had done this before, had rehearsed this moment in his nightmares until it became muscle memory. The heads followed, reaching into the fissure, their necks extending impossibly far, their mercury eyes reflecting the nothingness of the vertical shaft. But Ian was not there. He had found a ledge, a crawl space, a fold in the stone that the committee could not access without reconfiguring its entire mass, and he was waiting, silent once more, having traded his noise for concealment, having purchased his life with the currency of maximum disturbance. Armin lay beside Maggie, waiting for the heads to return, waiting for the committee to remember the unfinished business on the chamber floor. But the minutes passed, and the heads did not return. The creature was occupied, its attention captured by the challenge of the vertical shaft, by the puzzle of the guide's disappearance, by the promise of more interesting prey lurking in the spaces above. And in that occupation, Armin found a window of possibility so narrow it was almost invisible, a crack in the predator's attention through which a wounded, dying man might crawl toward the distant possibility of light. He moved. He moved with the agonizing slowness of a man whose skin was blistering from caustic exposure, whose muscles were cramping from sustained terror, whose mind was fragmenting under the weight of impossible experience. He crawled away from Maggie's body, not looking back, not daring to breathe, moving toward a tunnel mouth he had spotted during the chaos of the initial attack, a dark opening that led away from the central chamber and into the unknown depths of the cave system. It was not the way out. It was probably a dead end, or a route that led deeper into the creature's territory, into the heart of the hearth of the earth where the oldest heads waited in centuries of absolute silence. But it was away from the immediate presence of the committee, and that was enough. That was all he had. He crawled for what felt like days. The tunnel narrowed and widened, branched and rejoined, formed a labyrinth of geological confusion that seemed designed to disorient rather than to guide. He passed through chambers where the mineralized secretions grew so thick they formed curtains of translucent crystal that he had to push through like a swimmer breaking the surface of a viscous lake. He passed through spaces where the air was so heavy, so pressurized, that he felt his eardrums straining against the weight of it, his sinuses aching with the sustained density. He passed through zones of absolute darkness where his headlamp, its battery nearly exhausted, revealed only the immediate circle of his own hunched form, leaving the rest of the world to the Balaur's eyes, to the committee's patient, distributed gaze. And he passed, finally, into a space where the air changed, where the humidity dropped, where the smell of sulfur and ancient breath was replaced by something else, something that made his ruined heart lurch with a spasm of impossible hope. the smell of pine resin, of cold mountain air, of the surface world. The exit was a crack, a mere crevice in the face of a cliff that opened onto a ledge overlooking a valley he did not recognize, a place of snow and rock, and the distant glimmer of dawn light on the eastern horizon. Armin squeezed through, his shoulders tearing against the stone, his blistered skin scraping off in sheets that left smears of blood and tissue on the rock. He emerged onto the ledge and collapsed, his body spent, his consciousness flickering like a flame in a draft. The cold air washed over him, the wind of the high Carpathians cutting through his shredded clothing with a savagery that was almost welcome after the humid, pressurized warmth of the deep earth. He lay there, gasping, weeping, laughing in a hoarse, broken voice that was barely audible above the whistle of the wind. And then he heard the sound of someone climbing, hands gripping the rock below the ledge, boots finding purchase on the cliff face, a body hauling itself up from the depths with the exhausted determination of a man who had cheated death not once but 1,000 times in the course of a single night. Ian, the guide, pulled himself onto the ledge and lay beside Armin, his chest heaving, his face a mask of blood and stone dust, and the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had looked into the abyss and had not looked away quickly enough. They did not speak. They could not speak. They simply lay there, two survivors in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensibly large and bright and indifferent to the horrors they had endured, and they watched the sun rise over the Carpathians with the blank, traumatized expressions of men who had forgotten how to process beauty. It was Armin who broke the silence, finally, his voice a rasp that barely carried above the wind. "Why?" he asked, the question containing multitudes. "Why did we survive? Why did it let us go? Why did you come back for me?" Ian turned his head slowly, the movement requiring an effort that suggested his body had been damaged in ways that were not yet visible, and his eyes, those dark, ancient eyes that had seen too much, met Armin's with an expression of infinite weariness. "It didn't let us go," Ian said, each word emerging with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this explanation in his mind 1,000 times, who had known that if he survived he would have to speak these words to someone who would not understand them until it was too late. "It doesn't let anyone go. It releases. There is a difference." Armin stared at him, his blistered face contorting with the effort of comprehension. "I don't understand," he whispered. "We escaped. We got out. We're alive." Ian sat up, his movements stiff and painful, and he looked back at the crevice through which they had emerged, the dark mouth of the cave system that now seemed so small, so innocent, so easily overlooked by anyone hiking the mountain trails. "The Balaur is old," Ian said, his voice taking on the cadence of storytelling, of the oral tradition that had preserved this knowledge across generations of guides and shepherds and smugglers who had learned to respect the mountain's deeper hungers. Older than the mountains, older than the people who first named it. It has learned things that younger predators do not know. It has learned patience. It has learned investment. It has learned that a single meal, no matter how rich, is less valuable than a steady supply." He paused, rolling another cigarette with fingers that trembled not from cold but from the memory of what they had touched in the dark. "The gold is real, Dr. Voss. The gems are real. The hearth of the earth exists, and it is magnificent beyond anything your corporate masters could imagine, but it is not there for us to take. It is there for us to see, to remember, to tell others about." Armin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. "The lure," he said, the words barely audible. "It's farming us." Ian nodded, the gesture heavy with the weight of ancestral knowledge. "It lets a few escape. Not many. One or two every few decades when the world has forgotten and the silence has grown too deep. It lets them escape so that they will tell the world what waits in the dark. So that the greedy will come again with their drills and their dynamite and their shouting, with their noise and their light and their desperate, wonderful disturbance. The Balaur doesn't want all of us. It wants enough of us to keep the legend alive, to keep the pipeline flowing." to ensure that every generation provides its share of stimulus, its contribution of years, its payment of noise and terror and the precious, precious breaking of silence. He lit the cigarette, the flame from his lighter flickering in the wind, and he exhaled smoke that was immediately torn away by the gusts. We are not survivors, Dr. Voss. We are advertisements. We are the bait for the next group. We are the proof that the treasure is real, that the legend is true, that the hearth of the earth waits for those brave enough to seek it. Armin's mind reeled under the implications. He thought of the corporate backers, the wealthy collectors, the endless human appetite for the rare and the valuable and the forbidden. He thought of how his own story would be received, the tale of a disgraced paleontologist who had found the ultimate proof of his theories, who had survived the ultimate encounter with the impossible, who could lead the next expedition back to the site with the credibility of experience and the authority of survival. He would be famous. He would be funded. He would be courted by universities and corporations and governments eager to exploit the discovery of the century. And every time he spoke, every lecture he gave, every interview he granted, every book he signed, he would be planting seeds in the minds of the next generation of victims, fertilizing the legend with the compost of his own credibility, ensuring that the Balaur would never again want for visitors. "I won't tell," Armin said, the words emerging with a conviction he did not feel. "I'll never speak of it. I'll let the legend die." Ian's laugh was a dry, bitter sound devoid of humor. "The legend never dies, Dr. Voss. It sleeps. It waits. It counts the years of silence just as the Balaur counts them. And when the silence grows deep enough, when the world has forgotten and the cave has been left alone for too long, the creature releases another survivor, or it finds another way to make its presence known. A hiker who disappears, a shepherd who hears strange sounds, a scientist who finds impossible fossils. It has been doing this for longer than humans have walked these mountains. It will continue long after we are gone. The only question is whether we will be among the ones who feed it, or among the ones who merely advertise the menu." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that clung to the valleys below, revealing a landscape of extraordinary beauty that seemed to mock the horrors beneath its surface. The Carpathian stretched before them in waves of snow-capped peaks and dark forests, a wilderness that had swallowed empires and preserved secrets, that had hidden the Balaur and its kin from the prying eyes of civilization for millennia. It was a beautiful world, Armin thought, a world worth surviving in, even if survival meant complicity in an endless cycle of predation that used human greed as its primary mechanism of reproduction. "What do we do?" Armin asked finally, the question of a man who had exhausted all his own answers. "How do we live with this?" Ian stood, his joints popping with the effort, his body a map of pain and damage that would never fully heal. "We walk," he said simply. "We walk away. We go back to our lives, whatever is left of them, and we carry the weight of the gilded breath. The knowledge that every step we take on the surface is a step taken in debt, that our years were purchased with the years of others, that our silence is just another form of the creature's silence, another note in the endless counting." He began to walk along the ledge, his boots crunching on the snow and stone, his figure already becoming small against the vastness of the mountain. "And we hope," he added, not looking back, "that when the next ones come, and they will come, Dr. Voss, they always come, that we are not among them, that we have grown too old, too slow, too uninteresting to serve as advertisements anymore, that the Balaur finds better messengers, louder storytellers, greedier souls to carry the lure back to the world of light and noise." Armin followed, his movements mechanical, his body moving independently of his shattered mind. They descended the mountain through passes that Ian seemed to know by instinct, through forests where the trees grew so close together that the sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered coins of gold, through meadows where wildflowers grew in profusion, and the air smelled of honey and pollen, and the simple, uncomplicated sweetness of the surface world. They did not speak again. There was nothing more to say. The words had all been used up, consumed by the cave and the creature and the committee of instincts that had processed them as thoroughly as it had processed their companions. They reached a road, eventually, a dirt track that led to a village where Ian knew a farmer who would give them water and bread and ask no questions about their appearance, their wounds, their haunted eyes. From there, they traveled by bus to Cluj-Napoca, sitting in the back seats, not touching, not looking at each other, watching the countryside roll past the windows with the blank expressions of men who had seen what lay beneath the picturesque surface of the world and could no longer find comfort in the scenery. In the city, they parted without ceremony, without exchange of contact information, without promises to keep in touch. They were bound by a knowledge that needed no reinforcement, a complicity that required no maintenance. They would carry the Balaur with them for the rest of their lives, a weight that would never be lifted, a debt that would never be paid. Armin Voss returned to Vienna, to a small apartment that smelled of old books and loneliness, and he tried to resume the thread of a life that had been severed by his own ambition. He did not call the media. He did not contact Apex Meridian Holdings. He did not publish his findings or share his theories or seek the redemption that had driven him into the mountains. He simply existed, day after day, in a state of suspended animation that mirrored the creature's own mode of being, waiting in silence for something he could not name. He wrote in his journal, not the scientific accounts he had planned, but fragments of nightmare, descriptions of the committee that he would never show to another living soul. He drank too much. He slept too little. He woke in the night with the taste of sulfur on his tongue and the pressure of the Balaur's gaze upon his closed eyelids. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the morning, when the city was silent and the weight of the air seemed to press against his windows with an intensity that recalled the cave, he would hear it. Not with his ears, but with the deeper sense that the creature had awakened in him, the predatory intuition that had been installed in his nervous system, like a secondary operating system. He would hear the shifting of massive stone, the grinding of scales against limestone, the slow, patient extension of necks that had grown longer in the months since his escape. He would hear the counting, the endless geological counting of the years of silence, accumulating like interest in an account that would never be closed. One morning, 6 months after his return, Armin received a letter. It was from a law firm in Geneva, acting on behalf of the estate of the Voss brothers, Dieter and France. The twins had left him their share of the expedition's potential profits, a sum that would have made him wealthy beyond his modest academic dreams. He burned the letter in his kitchen sink, watching the paper curl and blacken, watching the words of wealth and inheritance transform into ash that he flushed down the drain. He did not want the gold. He understood now, with the final clarity of a man who has touched the truth and been branded by it, that the gold was never the point. The gold was the lure. The gold was the promise. The gold was the beautiful, glittering, mineralized saliva that kept the world coming back for more, generation after generation, century after century, an endless supply of greedy souls willing to trade their years for the illusion of wealth. He moved to the mountains, eventually, to a small village in the Carpathians not far from where he had entered the cave, though not so close that he could hear the creature's movements on quiet nights. He became a recluse, a hermit, a cautionary tale that the locals told their children about the foreigner who had gone into the deep places and come back wrong. He lived in silence. He cultivated the quiet. He learned, in his own small way, to count the years of stillness, to aggregate the silence, to become part of the background noise of the mountain rather than the disturbance that attracted the committee's attention. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the air was heavy with the weight of old memory, he would stand at the window of his cabin and look toward the peak where the crevice waited, where the fissure led down into the hearth of the earth, where the Balaur continued its endless growth in the perfect darkness of absolute isolation. He would stand there, not moving, barely breathing, and he would listen. And he would hear, faint but unmistakable, the distant rumble of shifting stone, the sound of a mountain adjusting its weight, the sound of a creature farming its crop, waiting for the next harvest, waiting for the next group of greedy, noisy, wonderful humans to come seeking the treasure that was real, but would cost them everything they had and everything they were. It didn't want the gold, Armin would whisper to himself, the words a mantra, a prayer, a warning that no one would ever hear. It wanted the years. And in the silence that followed, in the heavy, counting silence of the Carpathian night, he would wonder if the creature could hear him, if his whisper was just enough disturbance to add another fraction of a second to the Balaur's endless tally, another increment to the aggregation that would continue long after his own years had been consumed by the darkness he had escaped, but could never truly leave. Far below, in the absolute dark of the hearth of the earth, the committee convened in the silence of millennia, and the counting continued. The Echo of Xibalba. Stop screaming. The sound isn't a signal for help, it's a dinner bell. Matteo X hissed the words through lips that had gone white with terror, his calloused hand clamped over Priya Patel's mouth with a strength that surprised them both. The graduate student's eyes were wild above his fingers, her pupils blown wide in the dying light of Dr. Lena Vasquez's headlamp, which was sputtering its last reserves of lithium-ion energy into a trembling amber, thread barely strong enough to reveal the sweat-slicked limestone walls of the passage that had become their tomb. The air in the tunnel was viscous, wrong, a suspension of ancient moisture and mineral decay that seemed to resist inhalation. As if the cave itself were trying to teach them that breathing was a privilege, they had forfeited the moment they descended past the threshold of the surface world. Lena had been holding her breath for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, her lungs burning with the accumulated carbon dioxide, her diaphragm spasming with the biological imperative to inhale and exhale, to resume the metabolic process that kept her heart beating and her brain conscious. But they had learned something in the hours since they had entered the lowest chambers of the cenote system. The thing that hunted them did not see. It did not hunt by vision. The darkness of the cave was not a disadvantage for Camazotz. It was its native element, its operating system, the medium in which it had evolved, or had been created, or had simply always existed, to a perfection that rendered eyes obsolete. To scream was to paint a target on yourself in a medium where sound was the only relevant currency. To breathe loudly was to illuminate yourself with a flashlight in a world where darkness was absolute. To make any noise at all was to invite the surgical precision of the death that waited in the vaulted spaces above them, below them, around them, in every direction at once. She released her breath in the slowest, most controlled exhalation she could manage, the air passing through her nostrils in a stream so thin that it made no audible sound above the ambient drip of water from the ceiling. Beside her, Gabriel's stern mirrored her movement, the cinematographer's large frame compressed into an unnatural crouch that would have been comical under any other circumstances. His face, normally composed in the way of someone who had filmed volcanic eruptions and shark attacks with professional detachment, was slick with a sweat that smelled not of exertion, but of pure metabolic terror, the chemical signature of a nervous system that had recognized its own mortality, and was flooding his bloodstream with adrenaline in a futile attempt to prepare him for a death that no amount of adrenaline could prevent. "It's still mapping," Gabriel mouthed the words rather than speaking them, his lips forming the shapes without generating the vibrations, his eyes fixed on a point in the darkness above them, where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that their headlamps had not been able to fully illuminate before the batteries began their terminal decline. "I can feel the pressure, the pulses. It's scanning us." Lena didn't need to ask what he meant. They had all felt it by now, the rhythmic waves of displaced air that pressed against their eardrums in patterns too regular to be natural, too deliberate to be wind, too intelligent to be anything other than the echolocation of a predator that had been hunting in these depths since before the first human ancestor had crawled out of the primordial mud. It was not sound in the conventional sense. It was pressure, vibration. the physical manifestation of ultrasonic clicks that human ears couldn't detect, but human bodies could feel as a crawling sensation in the sinuses, a tingling in the dental nerves, a subsonic massage of the inner ear that built a three-dimensional image of their warm, breathing, trembling bodies from the acoustic reflections off their skin and bones, and the moist surfaces of their exposed mucous membranes. To Camazotz, they were not shapes in darkness but patterns of disturbance, warm objects in a cold environment, moving violations of the perfect silence that the creature had maintained for longer than human civilization had existed. "Don't move," Lena shaped the words with her lips, not trusting herself to whisper. "Don't breathe loud, don't think loud." But thinking loud wasn't something she could control. Her mind raced through the events that had brought them here, replaying the decisions with the terrible clarity of hindsight, each one a stepping stone across a river that had turned out to be an ocean of darkness. She had been the one to find the cenote, the one to identify the carved stairs, the one to convince the team that they had discovered the archaeological find of the decade, the House of Bats, mentioned in the Popol Vuh as one of the trials faced by the hero twins in their descent into Xibalba, the Maya underworld. She had been the one to ignore Mateo's warnings, to dismiss his people's stories as folklore, to lead 5 people into a geological anomaly that was not a cave but a doorway, not a sinkhole but a mouth, not a formation but a trap that had been waiting for centuries to be sprung. It had begun 11 days earlier, on the morning the rains finally stopped. The cenote had opened in a remote valley of the Guatemalan highlands, a sinkhole that swallowed 2 acres of subsistence cornfield, and revealed a vertical shaft that dropped 40 meters into darkness so complete that the local farmers claimed you could hear it breathing. Lena had been leading a survey team, 4 archaeologists and 1 local guide, documenting newly exposed sites in the region as part of a National Science Foundation grant. The cenote had screamed potential. The local KH farmers who owned the land had refused to approach it, making the sign of the cross and muttering about La Boca de Camazotz, the mouth of the death bat. Lena had found their fear quaint, folkloric, the kind of superstition she had navigated with performative respect and scientific authority in dozens of remote locations. Mateo Ix had been the exception. He was not a superstitious farmer. He was a professional guide in his early 60s who had spent 40 years leading archaeological teams through the jungles and highlands of Guatemala, who spoke fluent English, Spanish, and KH, Maya. He had agreed to guide the expedition because the money was good, and because he had hoped that Lena's team would find nothing more than an interesting geological formation. He had not believed, until he saw them with his own eyes, that the stairs were real. The stairs had been the first impossible thing. They emerged from the floor of the cenote in a spiral pattern that violated every principle of natural formation, each step carved from the bedrock itself, not laid on top of the stone but shaped from it, as if the limestone had been softened like clay and molded by hands, or tools, or something else entirely, that predated human engineering by geological epochs. The steps were worn but not eroded, the edges rounded in a way that suggested centuries of use but not millennia of natural weathering, and the tool marks were consistent with no known culture, no recognized technology, no classification system in the archaeological literature. They descended into darkness at a pitch that seemed to increase with each revolution of the spiral, as if the stairs were not fixed in space, but adapting to the descent, tightening their geometry to match the psychology of the climbers. "We photograph the stairs from the surface and we leave," Mateo had said, standing at the edge of the cenote rim, his face pale in the morning light that filtered through the highland mist, his hands trembling as he checked and rechecked his climbing harness with a compulsive repetition that Lena had initially attributed to professional caution and later recognized as the hypervigilance of a man who expects to die. "We document them, we measure them, we record their position, and we seal the cenote. We do not descend, not 1 step, not 1 meter. They're carved, Mateo," Lena had replied, her voice carrying the excitement of discovery, the intoxicating rush of being the first to touch something that no one had touched for centuries, perhaps millennia. Carved stairs don't exist in natural sinkholes. Someone built this. Someone used it. The House of Bats, if this is even remotely connected to the site mentioned in the Popol Vuh, it could rewrite everything we know about preclassic Maya cosmology. We need to see where they lead. The Popol Vuh is a sacred text, Matteo had said, his voice tight, controlled, the voice of a man who has seen too much to believe in coincidence. It is not a map. Xibalba is not a place you visit. It is a condition you enter. The House of Bats is not a ruin to be explored. It is a trial to be survived, if you are lucky, if the ancestors are merciful, and the ancestors have never been merciful to those who seek Xibalba for curiosity. But Lena had been immune to caution. She was 36, a Guatemalan-American archaeologist who had built her career on the tension between her scientific training at Berkeley and the indigenous knowledge she had rejected as a teenager. She had mapped burial chambers in the Patane Sealed for 1,000 years, documented cave systems in Belize that had rewritten Maya sacred geography. She had a private wound that drove her. Her father, a Guatemalan archaeologist, had disappeared in these same highlands 20 years earlier, his last journal mentioning the breathing cave and the stairs that shouldn't exist. The official record listed him as lost to a landslide, but Lena had found his journal after her mother's death, reading the entries with obsessive attention, trying to understand a father who had chosen archaeology over family, mystery over safety, the depths over the surface. She had convinced the team. Dr. Walter Cross, the senior archaeologist in his late 60s who had spent 45 years studying Mesoamerican iconography and had written 3 definitive texts on classic period cosmology, had been eager, perhaps too eager, to find evidence that predated the known archaeological record by millennia. Gabriel Stern, the cinematographer who had covered conflicts in Syria and Ukraine before transitioning to nature documentaries, had come because Lena had promised him footage that would change the genre, and because his marriage had ended 6 months earlier and he had nowhere else to be. Priya Patel, the graduate student from Mumbai via Stanford who was writing her dissertation on Mesoamerican underworld mythology, had practically begged to join, seeing the expedition as the fieldwork opportunity that would distinguish her from the 100 other South Asian archaeologists competing for tenure-track positions. And Matteo, despite his objections, had come because Lena had implied, gently, professionally, that refusing would mean losing future guide contracts with the university consortium that provided most of his annual income. They had descended on the 3rd day after discovery. Lena had rappelled into the cenote first, her harness creaking against the static rope, her headlamp cutting a cone of light through the humid air of the shaft that seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it, drinking the photons with a hunger that felt almost deliberate. The stairs had been exactly where the farmers had described them, emerging from the floor in a spiral that seemed to beckon rather than merely exist, each step bearing shallow incisions that were not decorative but functional, channels carved into the stone to drain water, to provide grip, to direct the flow of something that moved through this passage regularly, and with purpose that transcended human understanding. "The construction is remarkable," Walter had said, his voice echoing strangely in the shaft as he followed Lena down, his own headlamp creating intersecting beams of light that seemed to produce more shadows than they dispelled, as if the darkness were multiplying in response to their intrusion. "The tool marks are consistent with no known preclassic technology. The engineering is anomalous. This depth suggests a volcanic vent or a fault line, but the geology here is pure limestone karst. Limestone doesn't form vertical shafts like this without extensive dissolution, and there's no evidence of karst development at this elevation in the regional surveys." "Maybe the stairs were carved after the shaft formed," Priya had suggested, her voice carrying the bright enthusiasm of a student who has not yet learned that the most exciting discoveries are often the most dangerous. Or maybe the shaft was created deliberately, as a ceremonial entrance, a symbolic descent into Xibalba that was engineered to mirror mythological cosmology. Symbolism doesn't carve bedrock 40 meters deep, Walter had replied, but his tone suggested he was not dismissing the idea. He was intrigued. They all were. The stairs were a mystery, and mystery was the currency of their profession, the addictive substance that kept them descending into darkness when every instinct screamed at them to climb back toward the light. Matteo had descended last, his face a mask of controlled fear, his eyes scanning the walls with an intensity that Lena had initially attributed to professional caution and later recognized as the hypervigilance of a man who expects to die and is trying to choose the manner of his death. He had said nothing as they began to walk down the stairs, his boots scraping against the stone in a rhythm that seemed to match the beat of Lena's own heart, one step per heartbeat, descending into the earth with a deliberation that felt less like exploration and more like surrender. The atmospheric shift had begun after the first 150 meters. It was not gradual. It was abrupt, a threshold crossed in a single step, as if they had passed through an invisible membrane that separated the world of the surface from the world below, the realm of the living from the realm of the dead. The air became thick, humid, carrying a smell that Lena could only describe as wrong. It was not the smell of bat guano, which she had encountered in dozens of caves, nor the sulfur smell of volcanic vents, but something older and more organic, the smell of old copper and rotting fruit, of organic matter in the final stages of a decay that had lasted for centuries without completing its cycle, suspended in a state of perpetual decomposition that coated their skin with a film of ancient death. "Does anyone else smell that?" Gabriel had asked, his cinematographer's instincts warring with his physiological discomfort, his hand hovering near his camera as if he might document the smell if he could only figure out how to translate olfaction into image. Copper, Walter had said, his academic mind searching for classification. And something else, fermented, almost like papaya, mango, something tropical that's been left to rot in a sealed container. "It is not fruit," Matteo had said, his voice flat, toneless, the voice of someone who has given up on being heard by people who have already decided not to listen. "It is the breath of Xibalba. The air down here has not circulated with the surface for thousands of years. It carries the smell of the underworld, of death without resolution, of time without passage, of hunger without satisfaction." Lena had turned to him, impatient, her scientific curiosity overriding her manners and her better judgment. "Matteo, I respect your traditions, but we're dealing with a geological phenomenon here. Confined air in deep cave systems often develops unusual chemical signatures, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide accumulations. The smell is probably from anaerobic bacteria or mineral deposits, or the accumulation of organic matter in a sealed environment. It's not supernatural." "The smell is a warning," Matteo had replied, and he had not spoken again for a long time, his silence a heavier presence than his words had been. The carvings had appeared after the second 100 meters, emerging from the limestone walls like memories surfacing from deep water, like images that had been waiting for observers, and now that observers had arrived, could finally fulfill their purpose of being seen. They were images of Camazotz, the death bat, rendered in a style that was recognizably Maya but also disturbingly alien, the proportions wrong in ways that suggested not artistic interpretation but eyewitness observation by minds that had seen the creature and been driven mad by the sight. The bat was depicted not as a symbol but as a creature, its wings spanning the width of the passage, its body hunched in the posture of a predator about to strike, its head, that terrible leaf-nosed head, turned toward the viewer with an intensity that suggested the carving was not static but dynamic, not a representation but a window, not art but documentation. Lena had photographed them with her digital camera, the flash illuminating details that seemed to shift in the afterimage, the stone wings appearing to move when viewed from the corner of the eye, the bat's face seeming to track their progress as they descended. She had dismissed the effect as optical illusion, the product of fatigue and the strange acoustics of the stairwell, which produced reflections that seemed to come from directions that did not correspond to the physical geometry of the space. But deep down in the part of her mind that still spoke to her in her father's voice, she had known that the carvings were wrong. They were too detailed, too accurate, too alive. "They're remarkable," Walter had said, his scholarly enthusiasm undiminished by the growing strangeness of their surroundings, his academic hunger overriding his survival instincts with the ease of long practice. "The preservation is incredible given the humidity. The style is archaic, potentially much older than the preclassic period. If these are authentic, and I see no reason to doubt their authenticity, they could rewrite our understanding of proto-Maya cosmology. The iconography suggests a cult of Camazotz that predates the Popol Vuh by millennia, perhaps by entire cultural epochs." "They are not carvings," Matteo had said, his voice emerging from the darkness behind them with a quality that made Lena's skin crawl in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "They are warnings. They are not meant to be admired. They are not meant to be studied. They are meant to be obeyed, and we have already disobeyed by coming this far." But they had not obeyed. They had continued descending, their headlamps cutting beams through the humid dark that seemed to grow thicker with each meter of depth, their footsteps echoing in a stairwell that seemed to amplify some frequencies and swallow others, producing an acoustic environment that was not random but designed, not natural but engineered. The geometry of the passage had become wrong after the third 100 meters. Lena had noticed it first, a subtle disorientation that she attributed to fatigue until it became too pronounced to ignore. The stairs seemed to curve, not in a consistent arc, but in a way that changed depending on which direction you looked. When Lena faced forward, the stairs appeared to descend in a gentle spiral. When she turned to look back, they seemed to ascend in the opposite direction, leading not to the surface but to a deeper darkness that had not been there when she had faced forward. The walls seemed to lean inward when viewed from the corner of the eye, but stood perfectly vertical when examined directly. The ceiling appeared to recede into darkness at a rate that did not correspond to their descent, as if the space above were expanding while the space below contracted, as if they were not walking downstairs but being stretched between dimensions. "Lena," Walter had said, his scholarly enthusiasm finally cracking to reveal the uncertainty that had been growing beneath his academic confidence like a tumor. "Do you notice? I mean, is it just me, or does this passage seem geometrically impossible?" "It's a natural phenomenon," Lena had lied, because the alternative was unthinkable, because the alternative meant that everything she believed about the nature of reality was insufficient to explain what they were experiencing. The acoustics, the lighting, the lack of reference points, the effects of depth and pressure on spatial perception. Caves always play tricks on human neurology. We'll get to the bottom and it'll all make sense from a geological perspective. But she had not believed her own words. And when they reached the bottom, or what they had thought was the bottom, the end of the stairs, the floor of the cave system, they had found not a chamber but a continuation, not an ending but a threshold, not a destination but a beginning of something else entirely. The stairs ended in a vaulted space that their headlamps could not fully illuminate, a space that seemed to extend for hundreds of meters in every direction, and the floor of that space was covered with what appeared at first to be rocks, boulders, geological formations of the kind that were common in limestone caves throughout the Yucatan Peninsula and the Petén Basin. But they were not rocks, they were husks, thousands of them, petrified, leathery, desiccated remains of creatures that had been dead for so long that their species could not be identified by any taxonomy that existed in the scientific literature. Some of the husks were small, no larger than modern fruit bats, their fragile bones preserved in attitudes of flight or rest. Others were the size of dogs, of humans, their wing membranes still stretched between elongated finger bones, their bodies contorted into postures that suggested not peaceful death but violent extraction. And a few, scattered among the smaller remains in positions that suggested reverence or hierarchy, were larger still, their wingspans suggested by leathery membranes that had not fully decayed despite the millennia, their body plans hinting at masses measured in tons, creatures that had no right to exist in any ecosystem, that obeyed the laws of physics and biology as they were understood by human science. The chamber was a necropolis, a pantry of death stretching into darkness beyond their lights, and Lena felt her scientific framework begin to crack. "Oh my God," Priya had whispered, her graduate student's voice cracking with a mixture of awe and horror that was rapidly shifting toward horror as the implications of the scene began to penetrate her academic enthusiasm. "What is this place?" "A mass mortality site," Walter had said, his voice hushed, reverent, the tone of a man who has found the temple he has spent his life searching for and has discovered that it is not a temple but a tomb, not a place of worship but a place of consumption. A collection point, a repository. The bats came here to die, for thousands of years, perhaps millions. This is beyond anything we could have imagined. The preservation is unprecedented in the archaeological record. The environmental conditions must be unique: stable temperature, stable humidity, anaerobic chemistry that prevents decomposition while allowing desiccation. We need to document this. We need samples. We need to understand the taphonomy. "It is not a graveyard," Matteo had said, and his voice was the voice of someone who has walked into a nightmare and found it to be not a dream but reality, not a metaphor but a menu. "It is a pantry, and we are not observers. We are the next course." Walter had wandered away from the group, drawn by the academic's instinct to sample, to measure, to collect data from the extraordinary, to transform the incomprehensible into the dissertation and the peer-reviewed paper. He had moved toward one of the larger husks, a desiccated form the size of a human, positioned upright against the wall in a posture that suggested not natural death but deliberate placement, not the random fall of a dying animal but the careful arrangement of a ritual offering. The husk was not just large. It was preserved in a way that suggested not natural mummification but artificial preservation, the leathery skin intact, the wing membrane still stretched between the finger-like bones, the body positioned in a posture of suspended animation that suggested it had been placed rather than fallen, arranged rather than collapsed. And in the center of the husk's chest, gripped in the claws of its own desiccated feet, was an object that gleamed in the headlamp beam with a luster that drew the eye like a magnet, that compelled attention with a force that felt almost physical, almost gravitational. Is that a heart?" Walter had asked, his voice distant, distracted, the tone of a man who has found the prize that will make his career and validate his decades of scholarship. Lena had turned to look, her headlamp beam joining his, and she had seen it. An organ the size of a human head, not petrified like the rest of the husk but preserved, glistening, still wet-looking despite the millennia that must have passed since the creature's death. It was not a stone. It was not a fossil. It was biological material, maintained in a state of suspended decay by processes that Lena could not begin to understand, and it pulsed. Not with a heartbeat. The husk was dead, unquestionably dead, a shell that had been empty for centuries, but with a subtle, rhythmic shimmer that suggested the organ was not entirely inert, that some process was still occurring within its tissues, some metabolic ghost lingering in the biological machine, some function continuing long after the organism that had housed it had ceased to exist. "Walter, don't touch it," Lena had said, the words emerging with an urgency that surprised her, that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her scientific caution. "We don't know what it is. We don't know what it does. We don't know why it's still active." "It's a preserved biological specimen," Walter had replied, his voice carrying the cheerful confidence of a man who has already made up his mind and is no longer capable of hearing dissent. "Probably maintained by some kind of mineralization process or bacterial biofilm. The cave environment must have unique chemical properties, maybe mineral precipitation from the water table, maybe chemosynthetic bacteria that produce preservatives. This could be the discovery of the decade, Lena. This could be a new form of tissue preservation that revolutionizes our understanding of post-mortem processes. Imagine what we could learn from biological samples this old, this intact. Imagine the publications." He had reached out with his sampling tool, a long metal probe with a sterile tip that he had used in 100 excavations across Mesoamerica, and he had touched the heart. The contact had been minimal, a brief tap of metal against tissue that should have produced no reaction, no more significant than touching a mummy or a bog body or any other preserved remains that archaeology had encountered in its long history of disturbing the dead. But the reaction had been instantaneous and catastrophic. The husk, the dead, desiccated millennia-old husk, had moved. Not gradually, not with the creaking slowness of long-dormant tissue reactivating, but with a speed that was simply too fast for the human eye to track. A blur of leathery membrane and calcified bone that crossed the space between the husk and Walter in less time than it took for Lena's brain to register that movement had occurred. Less time than it took for her to open her mouth to scream a warning that would have arrived too late even if she had managed to voice it. The thing that emerged from the husk was not the husk itself. The husk was a shell, a disguise, a resting form that had been waiting for precisely this stimulus. What emerged was Camazotz, the death bat, the creature from the carvings, from the myths, from the Popol Vuh itself, rendered in flesh and blood, and a physics that defied the constraints of normal biology. It was not a bat, not in any taxonomic sense that Lena understood. It was a thing that wore the shape of a bat, that had the wings and the ears and the leaf-shaped nose of the chiropteran order, but it was scaled to a size that made the comparison absurd, that rendered the biological category irrelevant. Its wingspan was easily 6 meters. The membranes stretched between fingers that were not fingers, but elongated structural elements more akin to the ribs of an umbrella or the structural supports of a suspension bridge, each one terminating in a claw that could have disemboweled a horse or decapitated a human with equal efficiency. Its body was compact, muscular, covered not in fur but in a short, dense pelt that resembled velvet but had the sheen of wet leather, and its face, that terrible leaf-nosed face, was dominated by eye pits that were not eyes but voids of absolute darkness, voids that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, suggesting that the creature navigated not by vision, but by some other sense entirely, some perception that operated on principles that human science had not yet named. The attack had been surgical. That was the word that Lena would later use in the rare moments when she could force herself to think about what she had seen without dissociating from her own memories. Surgical, precise, efficient. The creature had not bitten Walter. It had not clawed him. It had not torn him or ripped him or mauled him in any of the ways that predators normally dispatch their prey. It had simply extended one wing, one massive, leathery wing, that seemed to unfold with a grace that was obscene given its lethal purpose, and swept it across the space where Walter's neck met his shoulders in a single, economical motion. Walter's head had separated from his body with a cleanliness that suggested not violence but intentionality, not tearing but cutting, not murder but ritual. The senior archaeologist's body had remained standing for a moment that stretched into eternity, a fountain of blood erupting from the stump of his neck with a pressure that painted the ceiling in arterial spray. And then it had collapsed, folding at the knees and waist like a marionette with its strings cut, pooling in the dust with a wet sound that was the most terrible thing Lena had ever heard. The head had rolled. That was the detail that haunted Lena most, the image that would wake her screaming for the rest of her life, however long that life might be. Walter's head had rolled across the floor of the chamber, coming to rest face up against the desiccated leg of another husk, its eyes still open, still conscious for a moment, impossibly, unbearably, staring at the ceiling with an expression of mild surprise, as if the British archaeologist were unaware that his body was no longer attached, as if he were still processing the data of his own decapitation. And then the light had gone out of those eyes, and the head had been still, and the creature had turned its attention to the rest of them with a deliberation that was more terrifying than any sudden attack could have been. They had run. There was no thought, no strategy, no attempt to fight or to reason with the thing that had just demonstrated its capacity for instantaneous decapitation. They ran, scattering across the chamber like insects when a stone is lifted, their headlamps strobing in the darkness as they stumbled over husks and rocks and the irregularities of the cave floor. Lena had run toward the nearest wall, her instinct to find cover, to find a crevice, to find any space too small for the creature to follow. Gabriel had run in the opposite direction, his longer legs carrying him toward a passage that seemed to lead deeper into the cave system, his cinematographer's instincts for survival overriding his professional obligation to capture footage. Priya had frozen, paralyzed not by any supernatural means but by the sheer, overwhelming shock of witnessing a beheading, her body refusing to obey her brain's commands to flee, her mind stuck in a loop of academic analysis that prevented action. And Matteo had not run at all. He had dropped to his knees, his hands clasped in front of his face, his lips moving in a prayer or a chant in Kayich that Lena could not hear over the sound of her own panicked breathing. The creature had not pursued them immediately. It had remained with Walter's body, or rather with Walter's head, and Lena, glancing back from the partial concealment of a rock formation that seemed to have been placed specifically to provide cover for fleeing prey, had watched in sick fascination as Camazotz bent over the severed head and did something that transcended mere predation, something that suggested not hunger but ritual, not consumption but collection. It had pressed its leaf-shaped nose against Walter's open mouth, and it had inhaled, not the normal inhalation of breathing, not the respiratory exchange of gases that sustain biological life, but a deep, sustained suction that lasted for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a vacuum that seemed to be drawing something out of the dead man's skull, something that was not air and not blood but something else, something invisible and essential and irreplaceable. Walter's face had changed during this process. It had sagged, aged, collapsed in on itself like a balloon losing air, the skin wrinkling, the cheeks hollowing, the eyes sinking into their sockets until the head looked not like a human head but like a mummy, a desiccated husk that bore only a superficial resemblance to the cheerful archaeologist who had touched the forbidden heart and paid the price for his curiosity. The breath, Matteo had whispered when Lena had crawled back to him when the creature had apparently finished its meal and had taken to the air, its wings beating with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar could have been. The Popol Vuh says that Camazotz decapitates the hero twins to silence them, not to kill them, to silence them. The breath is what it wants, the voice, the life that speaks, the years not yet lived. They had huddled together then, the 4 survivors, Lena, Gabriel, Priya, and Matteo, and they had listened to the creature circling in the darkness above them, its wings generating that terrible silence, that pressure against the eardrums that was the signature of its movement. The displacement of air so vast and so deliberate that Lena could feel it pressing against her eardrums in rhythmic waves that matched the pulse of her own racing heart, and then diverged from it, establishing a counter-rhythm that suggested the thing above them had multiple hearts, or no heart at all, or a cardiac system that operated on principles of fluid dynamics rather than biology. They had realized, gradually, through whispered exchanges and desperate theorizing, conducted in voices barely louder than the exhalation of breath, that the creature did not see. The eye pits were not organs of vision. They were organs of something else, something that mapped the cave not by light but by sound, that navigated the darkness by emitting pulses of ultrasound and reading the reflections, that built a three-dimensional image of its environment from the acoustic signatures of the rocks and the air, and the warm, breathing bodies of its prey. It was echolocation, but echolocation on a scale, and with a sophistication that no modern bat could approach, a sensory system that rendered the creature perfectly adapted to an environment where light was irrelevant and sound was everything. Echolocation, Gabriel had breathed, his war correspondent's mind still functioning despite the terror, still seeking the framework of understanding that might offer a pathway to survival. Like modern bats, but scaled up, much more sophisticated, the leaf-shaped nose it's a focusing apparatus. It directs the sound pulses, creates a beam, a sonic scalpel that maps every surface, every object, every living thing in the chamber. Then silence is our defense, Lena had said, the realization emerging with the force of revelation, the first genuinely useful thought she had had since Walter's death. If we don't make noise, it can't find us. It can't map us. We become invisible in a medium where sight is irrelevant. It can still smell us, Priya had whimpered, her composure shattered, her voice barely under control, her Indian accent thickened by stress into something that reminded Lena of her own mother's voice in moments of crisis. It can still hear our heartbeats. It can still feel our body heat. Silence isn't enough. Nothing is enough against something like that. It is enough for now, Matteo had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has accepted the terms of his own death and is now negotiating for the best possible outcome, the most dignified exit from a situation that offered no genuine hope of survival. The creature is full. It has fed. It will rest. It will digest. And while it rests, we move. We find a way out. We find the stairs. We climb back to the world of light. But the stairs were gone. They had discovered this in the hours that followed, as they crept through the chamber in absolute silence, their headlamps turned off to conserve batteries, their hands trailing along the walls to guide them, their feet testing each step before committing their weight to avoid the sound of a stumble. The passage they had descended was no longer there. The stairs had ended in a wall of solid limestone, a dead end that could not be explained by any geological process, but suggested that the passage had never existed, that their descent had been a journey not through physical space, but through something else, something that had delivered them to the creature's domain, and then sealed the door behind them with a finality that mocked their hope of return. They had found other passages, other tunnels, other staircases that led not upward but deeper, always deeper, into the bowels of the earth. They had found more chambers, more husks, more evidence that Camazotz had been hunting in these depths for longer than human civilization had existed, longer than human species had existed, perhaps longer than life on Earth had existed in its current forms. And they had found the carvings, the endless carvings of the bat god, each one positioned at a junction or a threshold, each one seeming to move when viewed from the corner of the eye, each one positioned slightly differently from the last, as if the stone itself were alive, as if the images were not representations but residents, guardians of a space that belonged to the creature in a way that no human claim could ever challenge. And now they were here in this tunnel, with the dying flashlight and the three survivors huddled together in a configuration of terrified intimacy, listening to the creature map them from the darkness above. The first phase of their ordeal was over. The descent had been completed. The threshold had been crossed. The first casualty had been taken, and the real horror was only beginning. The tunnel they had found was barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. A natural limestone passage that had been modified by hands or by water, or by something else entirely, into a corridor of dripping stone and stagnant air that pressed against their lungs with the weight of accumulated centuries. They had been crawling through it for what felt like hours but might have been minutes. Time had become elastic in the darkness, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of their terror, rather than the movement of any clock. Lena's headlamp had finally died, leaving them with only Gabriel's backup light and the faint phosphorescence of certain mineral deposits on the walls that glowed with a sickly green luminescence, just bright enough to transform absolute darkness into the suggestion of shapes that were worse than blindness, because they hinted at forms that the mind could populate with its deepest fears. They had established a protocol for movement. One person would lead, testing each step before committing their weight, while the others followed in single file, each hand on the shoulder of the person in front, creating a human chain of touch that was their only reliable sense in a world where sight had failed and hearing had become a liability. Gabriel led, his cinematographer's body still carrying the tension of someone who had filmed death before, but had never been forced to participate in it as a potential subject. Behind him came Priya, her graduate student's mind trying desperately to process what was happening through academic frameworks that crumbled under the weight of direct experience, her lips moving in silent recitations of Sanskrit mantras that she had learned as a child and abandoned as an adult, returning to them now in the way that drowning people return to the surface. Lena followed Priya, her archaeologist's hands trailing along the walls in search of carvings or markings that might indicate a way out, a passage upward, a return to the world of light and sound and breathable air. And Matteo brought up the rear, his eyes fixed on the darkness behind them, his body turned backward in a posture of perpetual vigilance that suggested he expected pursuit at every moment and was determined to be the first to see it coming. They moved in silence. Not the silence of empty spaces, but the silence of hunted things, the silence of prey that has learned that its only defense is the absence of sound, the negation of vibration, the withdrawal from the acoustic world that the predator had made its own. They breathed through their noses, controlling the passage of air so that no exhalation exceeded the volume of a whisper, so that no inhalation created a suction that might be detected by ears attuned to frequencies beyond human perception. They moved their feet with the deliberation of surgeons, testing each surface for stability before committing their weight, avoiding the loose stones and the pools of water and the patches of guano that might crackle or splash or squelch under pressure. They were not walking, they were infiltrating, inserting themselves into the environment with the minimum possible disturbance, becoming ghosts in a medium where solidity was the anomaly and insubstantiality was the norm. And still the creature found them. The first voice had been Walter's. It had come from somewhere ahead of them in the tunnel, from a junction where the passage split into 3 directions, each one equally dark and equally uninviting. The voice had been perfect, not a recording, not an imitation, but the voice itself, carrying all the inflections and the cadences and the slight British accent that Lena had known for 6 years. Since her first conference in London, where Walter had been the keynote speaker, and she had been the nervous graduate student approaching him with questions that he had answered with the generosity of a man who genuinely loved teaching. "Lena," the voice had said, emerging from the darkness ahead with a clarity that suggested the speaker was standing just around the corner, just out of sight, just close enough to touch if she would only take a few more steps forward. "Lena, I've found the way out. It's this passage, the left one. There's a stairway. It leads up. I've checked it. It's safe. Come and see." She had almost moved. The impulse had been automatic, the response to a trusted voice in a situation of extreme stress, the neurological pathway that connected the sound of a friendly voice to the expectation of safety. Her foot had lifted, her weight had begun to shift forward, and then Gabriel's hand had clamped on her shoulder with a grip that bruised muscle and stopped her motion with a violence that was itself dangerously loud. "Don't," he had mouthed, his lips close to her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Walter's dead." She had known it intellectually. She had watched the decapitation. She had seen the head roll. She had watched the creature inhale something from the severed skull, but the voice had been so real, so present, so unmistakably Walter that some part of her brain, the part that operated below consciousness, the part that processed sound as emotion rather than information, had responded to it as truth, had accepted it as reality, had prepared to follow it into whatever darkness it led. "It's learning," Matteo had whispered, his voice barely audible, barely present, a vibration in the air that was more felt than heard. "It hears us. It learns our voices. It learns our names. It learns what we want to hear." Echolocation, Gabriel had breathed, his war correspondent's analytical mind still functioning despite the terror, still seeking the framework that might explain what was happening and provide a strategy for survival. Modern bats can learn to recognize individual voices. They can identify specific prey by sound. This creature, it's doing the same thing but on a different scale. It's not just mapping our bodies. It's mapping our minds, our memories, our relationships, our hopes. "Then we can't trust anything we hear," Lena had said, the realization emerging with a clarity that was almost worse than the ignorance it replaced. Any voice, any sound, any call for help, any warning, any direction, it could all be the creature. It could all be bait. They had continued past the junction, ignoring Walter's voice as it repeated its invitation, ignoring the pleading tone that crept into the words as they moved away, ignoring the final desperate cry of "Lena, please, it's getting dark. I can't see. Where are you going?" That was designed to trigger the guilt response, the rescue instinct, the imperative to save a colleague that had been drilled into them by years of team-based fieldwork. They had walked past it with their hands over their ears, their eyes fixed on the ground, their minds repeating the mantra of "not real, not real, not real," until the voice had faded behind them, replaced by the ambient silence of the cave that was itself a kind of sound, a pressure against the eardrums that never quite went away. But the voices had continued. They had come from different directions at different times, always at junctions where the group was most vulnerable, most uncertain, most in need of guidance. They had heard Priya's mother calling her name in Hindi, describing the mango tree in the courtyard of their family home in Mumbai, asking why she hadn't called, why she had abandoned her family, why she had chosen death over the life that had been prepared for her. They had heard Gabriel's ex-wife sobbing from somewhere to the right, begging him to come back, to forgive her, to save her from the darkness that was swallowing her whole. They had heard Lena's father, her dead father, her disappeared father, the man whose journal had led her to this place, speaking with the voice she had not heard since childhood, describing the beauty of the cave system he had found, the importance of the work, the necessity of continuing the research that he had begun and that she had inherited. "Lena Mija," the voice had said, emerging from a side passage that seemed to lead upward, that seemed to promise escape, that seemed to offer everything she had been searching for since her father's disappearance. "I'm here. I've been waiting. I found it. The House of Bats, it's real. It's everything I hoped for. Come and see. Come and be with me." She had stopped. She had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped thinking, her body frozen in a posture of arrested motion that was more complete than any paralysis could have been. The voice was her father's, not similar to her father's, not an imitation of her father's. Her father's voice, preserved somehow in the acoustic memory of the creature and reproduced with a fidelity that suggested not mimicry but extraction, not imitation but theft, not reproduction but consumption. "It's not him," Matteo had whispered, his hand on her back, his fingers pressing into her spine with a pressure that was meant to be reassuring but that felt like the grip of a drowning man. "It's the creature. It takes the breath. It takes the voice. It takes everything that makes us who we are. Your father is gone. This is only the echo." She had known he was right. She had known it with the same certainty with which she knew that the earth was round and that gravity pulled downward, and that human beings needed oxygen to survive. But the voice had been so real, so present, so full of the particular timbre and the particular cadence and the particular warmth that she had associated with her father's presence, that the knowledge had not been enough to prevent the response. She had wanted to follow that voice more than she had wanted to live. She had wanted to hear it again more than she had wanted to breathe. She had wanted to believe that her father was waiting for her in the darkness more than she had wanted to accept the reality of his death and the finality of his absence. They had dragged her past the junction, Gabriel and Matteo working together to move her feet when her legs refused to obey, to guide her hands when her fingers reached toward the voice, to turn her face away from the side passage when her eyes strained to see into the darkness where the voice originated. She had wept silently, the tears streaming down her face in a flood that made no sound, that produced no sobs, that generated no acoustic signature that the creature could detect. She had wept for her father, for Walter, for herself, for the life that she had led that had brought her to this place of endless darkness and stolen voices, and a predator that consumed not flesh but identity. The psychological war had escalated as they descended deeper. The creature did not merely reproduce voices. It began to reproduce sounds that had no human origin, but that triggered primal responses in the human nervous system. They heard the sound of rain on a tin roof, a sound that promised shelter and safety and the comfort of home, emerging from passages that led not to shelter, but to deeper darkness. They heard the sound of a baby's cry, a sound that triggered the caregiving instinct in all of them, that made them want to rush toward the source and offer protection, that emerged from crevices too narrow for a human to enter and too deep for a human to survive. They heard the sound of running water, the promise of hydration, and the suggestion of a stream that might lead to the surface, emerging from dead-end chambers where the only moisture was the stagnant condensation of millennia. "It's hurting us," Gabriel had realized, his voice hoarse from the effort of remaining silent, his throat raw from the constant suppression of the cough that the cave's air seemed to trigger. "It's not just trying to lure us, it's directing us, moving us where it wants us to go, like a sheepdog with sheep, like a shepherd with a flock." "Where does it want us to go?" Priya had asked, her voice barely a breath, her eyes wide with the terror of someone who has understood that she is not a survivor but livestock, not a participant but a commodity, not an agent but an object. "Deeper," Matteo had said, and the word had carried the weight of finality, the weight of acceptance, the weight of someone who has read the ending of the story and knows that there is no twist, no reversal, no last-minute rescue. Always deeper, toward the center, toward the heart, toward the place where it feeds. They had found the altar in a chamber that opened before them like the interior of a cathedral built by insane hands, a space so vast that their light could not reach the ceiling or the far walls, so ancient that the limestone had been transformed by time and pressure, and perhaps by other processes, into formations that suggested not geology but architecture, not natural formation but deliberate construction. The floor was paved with hexagonal stones, each one carved with symbols that were recognizably Maya but older than any known script, symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when viewed from different angles, suggesting that they were not static inscriptions but dynamic records, not messages from the past but warnings from the present. And at the center of the chamber, rising from the hexagonal floor like a growth from diseased tissue, was the altar. It was not a stone table of the kind that appeared in popular imagination when the word altar was spoken. It was a structure of bone and crystal, and something that looked like petrified wood but might have been organic material transformed by processes that no human laboratory could replicate. It was shaped like a leaf-nosed bat's head, massive, grotesque, beautiful in the way that only things that exist beyond human morality can be beautiful, and its surface was covered with indentations that were not decorative but functional, not aesthetic but operational, each one shaped to hold something specific, something that the creature required for its continued existence. "The tithe," Matteo had whispered, his voice carrying the reverence of someone who has found the physical manifestation of a myth he had only known as story, the confirmation of a truth that he had hoped would remain abstract. "The tithe of breath." Lena had approached the altar with the caution of someone approaching a live explosive, her archaeologist's instincts warring with her survival instincts, her hands trembling as they traced the contours of the structure, her mind recording details that she knew she would never be able to publish, never be able to share, never be able to verify with the academic community that had trained her and funded her and sent her to this place of absolute horror. The altar was old. Not centuries old, not millennia old, but older than the human species, older than the current geological epoch, older than the configuration of continents that existed in the present day. The material of its construction was not of this earth, not in any recognizable sense, and the indentations on its surface were filled with residues that Lena could not identify, but that she knew, with a certainty that transcended scientific method, were the remains of the breath that the creature had collected over millennia of predation. "The Popolva," Matteo had said, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on the altar with an expression that was neither fear nor awe, but something that combined both, something that suggested he had expected to find this and had hoped he would not. "The Popolva says that Camazotz decapitates the hero twins not out of malice but to silence them, to take their voices, to take their breath, to take their years. The creature does not eat flesh. It eats sound. It eats the acoustic signature of life. It eats the voice that speaks, the breath that sings, the word that names." "Then it's not a predator," Gabriel had said, his war correspondent's mind finding the framework even in the midst of horror, still seeking the understanding that might provide a strategy. "It's a collector, a curator. It takes the voices and it stores them. It uses them. It replays them. It farms them." "Yes," Matteo had said, and the word was the most terrible thing Lena had heard, more terrible than the decapitation, more terrible than the voices, more terrible than the darkness itself. "It farms, and we are the crop." The realization had hit them with the force of physical impact, a psychological blow that was worse than any physical blow could have been. The creature did not hunt for sustenance in the way that predators normally hunted. It hunted for content, for material, for the acoustic signatures that it could collect and store and reproduce and use to lure future prey. Walter's voice was not a tragic loss but a resource, a tool that would be used to lure other archaeologists, other explorers, other curious humans who would follow the voice of a respected colleague into the darkness and add their own voices to the collection. Lena's father's voice was not a memory but a lure, a bait that had been set for 20 years waiting for the daughter who would come searching, who would follow the journal into the cave, who would add her own voice to the chorus of the consumed. "The cave is designed for this," Lena had said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who has understood the architecture of her own destruction, who has recognized that she is not in a natural environment but in a machine, not in a geological formation but in a trap. "The acoustics, the geometry, the carvings, the stairs, everything is designed to bring people here, to bring them down, to bring them to this place, to feed the creature." "Xibalba is not a place," Matteo had said, repeating the words he had spoken at the surface but now carrying the weight of experience rather than the weight of warning. "It is a condition, a system, a machine that runs on the breath of the living, and we have entered it, we have become part of it. We are fuel now. We are data. We are the next course in a meal that has been running since before human beings existed." They had stood before the altar in the silence of absolute comprehension, the silence of people who have understood that they are not explorers but resources, not scientists but subjects, not agents but objects in a system that predated their existence and would continue after their consumption. The creature had not attacked them in this chamber. It had not needed to. The chamber itself was the attack, the revelation was the weapon, the understanding was the trap that would keep them here, paralyzed by comprehension, waiting for the moment when the creature would come to collect what they had already surrendered, their hope, their agency, their will to escape. And then the cave had begun to make noise. It started with a drip, a single drop of water falling from the ceiling onto the hexagonal floor, producing a sound that was not the natural plink of water on stone, but something sharper, something more deliberate, something that carried a rhythm that suggested not random formation but intentional percussion. Then another drip, and another, until the chamber was filled with a rhythmic pattern that was not music but was organized like music, not language but was structured like language, a sequence of sounds that pressed against the eardrums with a physical force that made them want to cover their ears, to block the sound, to escape the acoustic assault. But they could not escape. The sounds were coming from everywhere at once, from the ceiling and the walls and the floor and the air itself, a surround sound assault that was designed not to deafen but to direct, not to harm but to control. The sounds were pushing them, hurting them, guiding them toward the altar, toward the indentations, toward the places where the breath was collected and stored and consumed. "It's the panic trigger," Gabriel had gasped, his hands pressed against his ears, his face contorted in a rictus of pain and fear. "The cave is designed to trigger panic, to make us run, to make us scream, to make us breathe, to make us loud." And he was right. The sounds were not random. They were calculated, engineered, optimized to produce the maximum physiological stress response in the human nervous system. The dripping water was timed to match the heart rate, accelerating it, driving it toward tachycardia. The echoes from the walls were arranged to create disorientation, to destroy the sense of direction, to make the chamber seem larger and smaller simultaneously. The subsonic vibrations from the floor were calibrated to trigger the vestibular system, producing nausea, vertigo, the sense of falling that made them want to reach out, to grab something, to make noise in their desperation for stability. Lena had felt her control slipping, felt the carefully maintained silence of their journey beginning to crack under the assault of the engineered acoustic environment. She had wanted to scream. She had wanted to run. She had wanted to do anything that would produce a sound, a movement, a vibration that would break the pattern of the cave's assault and restore some sense of agency, some sense of control, some sense that she was still a human being and not just a component in a machine designed to harvest breath. "Hold," Matteo had commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that surprised them all, that suggested reserves of strength that they had not suspected. "Hold still, hold silent, hold your breath. The creature is not attacking, it is. It is tuning, it is calibrating, it is preparing the chamber for collection. If we make noise now, we complete the circuit. We activate the trap, we become part of the collection." They had held. They had held through the dripping and the echoing and the subsonic assault, held through the nausea and the vertigo and the desperate urge to scream, held through the terror that was not just fear of death but fear of dissolution, fear of becoming not a corpse but a voice, not a body but a recording, not a person but a tool for the luring of future victims. They had held until the sound stopped, until the chamber returned to its natural silence, until the creature apparently decided that they were not yet ready for harvest and moved on to other prey or other business. And then they had heard the screaming. It was not their screaming. It was not the screaming of any of the 4 survivors who had maintained their silence with a discipline that bordered on the superhuman. It was the screaming of someone else, someone new, someone who had apparently followed the same stairs, descended the same passage, entered the same trap that they had entered. The screams were high-pitched, desperate, female, and they carried an accent that Lena recognized after a moment of horrified listening. Spanish, Guatemalan Spanish, the voice of a local woman who had somehow found her way into the cave system and was now experiencing the same horrors that they had experienced, the same decapitation, the same consumption, the same transformation from person to voice. "No," Matteo had whispered, his face going gray with a horror that transcended his own situation, that spoke of guilt and responsibility and the crushing weight of knowledge that could have prevented tragedy. "No, no, no, not her. Not now, not here." "Who is it?" Lena had asked, her voice barely audible, her mind already forming the answer before Matteo could speak it. "My daughter," Matteo had said, and the words were the sound of a man whose world has ended, whose hope has been consumed, whose future has been devoured by the same darkness that had already taken his present. Sophia. She knew where I was going. She warned me not to come. She must have followed. She must have come to find me. And now she is. He could not finish the sentence. The screaming continued, rising to a pitch that was beyond human vocal capacity, beyond the limits of the larynx and the vocal cords, beyond anything that a living throat could produce. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not with the trailing off of someone who has exhausted their capacity for sound, but instantly, completely, absolutely. The silence that followed, more terrible than the screaming, had been because it meant that the voice had been collected, that the breath had been taken, that the person who had owned the voice was now just another recording in the creature's collection, another lure for the next group of curious humans who would follow the stairs into the darkness. Matteo had collapsed. Not physically, he had remained standing, his body rigid with a tension that suggested he was holding himself upright through sheer force of will, but emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. The man who had guided them with authority and caution and the weight of cultural knowledge had been replaced by a hollow shell, a body that moved and breathed but no longer contained the spirit that had animated it. His daughter was gone. His lineage was ended. His future had been consumed by the same creature that had consumed Walter and would consume them all if they did not find a way to escape. "We need to move," Lena had said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised her, that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind, from the part of her that had survived her father's disappearance and built a career from the ruins of that loss, from the part of her that refused to be consumed without resistance. "We need to find a way out. Not up, the stairs are gone. Not down, that's where it wants us to go. We need to find another way, a crack, a fissure, a passage that it doesn't control." "There is no way out," Matteo had said, his voice empty, mechanical, the voice of someone who has accepted the completeness of his defeat. "There is only through the center, through the heart, through the place where it feeds. That is the only path that leads anywhere, and that path is death." "Then we make our own path," Gabriel had said, his war correspondent's resilience reasserting itself, the same resilience that had carried him through firefights and ambushes and the collapse of civilization in places where the veneer of order had been stripped away to reveal the violence beneath. "We find a weakness. We find a blind spot. We find something that it doesn't expect, and we exploit it." They had moved through the chamber in a new formation, no longer following the passages that the creature seemed to control, but searching for anomalies, for irregularities, for the cracks in the perfect system that might allow them to escape. They had found them, small fissures in the walls, narrow chimneys in the ceiling, passages that seemed to lead nowhere, but that offered the possibility of somewhere other than the creature's domain. But each one had been a dead end. Each one had terminated in a wall of solid limestone. Each one had been another trap, another lure, another component in the machine that was designed to keep them moving, to keep them breathing, to keep them producing the acoustic signatures that the creature collected and consumed. And all the while, the voices had continued. Walter's voice and Priya's mother's voice and Gabriel's ex-wife's voice and Lena's father's voice, and now Sophia's voice, all of them calling from different directions, all of them promising safety and rescue and reunion, all of them lying with the perfect sincerity of recordings that had no understanding of truth, no capacity for deception, no morality beyond the imperative to lure, to collect, to consume. They had reached the lowest chamber at the end of the second day of their descent. It was a space that seemed to exist at the bottom of the world, at the point where the Earth's crust gave way to something else, something that was not mantle or core but void, not geological but metaphysical, not physical but conditional. The floor was covered with a substance that was not rock or soil or water, but something that shimmered and shifted and seemed to absorb the light from Gabriel's dying headlamp. A substance that felt cold and warm simultaneously, that was solid and liquid simultaneously, that was present and absent simultaneously. And in the center of the chamber, hanging from the ceiling in a posture of suspended animation that suggested not sleep but readiness, not rest but anticipation, was Camazotz, the death bat, the creature that had hunted them through the tunnels, that had taken Walter and Sophia and countless others before them, that had built this entire system as a machine for the collection of breath. It was larger than it had been in the first chamber. Or perhaps it was the same size and they were smaller, diminished by their descent, reduced by their terror, compressed by the weight of the earth above them into versions of themselves that were less substantial, less real, less alive than they had been on the surface. Its wings were folded against its body, but even folded they spanned the width of the chamber. The membrane stretched between structural elements that were not bones but something harder, something sharper, something that seemed to generate its own faint luminescence. A bioluminescence that was not soft and blue like deep-sea creatures but harsh and red like emergency lights, like warning signs, like the color of arterial blood. Its face was turned toward them, the leaf-shaped nose pointed in their direction, the eye pits absorbing the light from Gabriel's headlamp and returning nothing, giving nothing, offering nothing but the void that existed at the center of the creature's being. And from that nose, from that terrible focusing apparatus, came the pulses, the echolocation, the acoustic mapping that rendered them visible in the darkness, that built their images in the creature's mind with a resolution that was probably finer than human vision could achieve, that showed every tremor of every muscle, every bead of sweat on every forehead, every involuntary spasm of fear that rippled through their bodies. They had frozen, not by choice but by necessity, by the biological imperative that says when a predator has detected you and you cannot outrun it, the only option is to become invisible, to become silent, to become so still that the predator's senses might miss you, might overlook you, might decide that you are not worth the effort of pursuit. But the creature did not pursue. It did not attack. It did not move from its position on the ceiling. It simply hung there, pulsing, mapping, waiting, and Lena realized with a horror that transcended even the horror of the decapitation that the creature was not waiting for them to move. It was waiting for them to breathe. It was waiting for them to make noise. It was waiting for them to become loud enough to be worth the effort of collection. "It's not going to kill us," she had whispered, the words emerging with a certainty that came not from reasoning but from intuition, not from analysis but from the direct perception of the creature's intent. "It's going to farm us. It's going to keep us here, alive, breathing, making noise, until we're ripe, until we're ready, until we've produced enough content." "Then we need to get out now," Gabriel had said, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who has understood the nature of his captivity and has decided that death in escape is preferable to life in imprisonment. "Before it decides we're ready, before it comes down to collect, before we're just another voice in the darkness." They had searched the chamber with desperate intensity, their hands trailing along every surface, their feet testing every irregularity, their eyes straining in the dying light for any passage, any crack, any opening that might lead away from the creature and toward the surface. And they had found it, a narrow fissure in the wall, barely wide enough for a human body, that seemed to lead upward at a steep angle, that promised not salvation but the possibility of salvation, not escape but the chance of escape. But the fissure was too narrow for all of them. It was a passage for one person, perhaps two if they squeezed, but not for four. And the creature was waiting, hanging, mapping, its patience infinite, its hunger patient, its collection methods refined by millennia of practice. They were at the climax now, the point where the story demanded sacrifice, where survival required loss, where escape meant leaving someone behind. They looked at each other in the red glow of the creature's bioluminescence, and they saw not colleagues or friends or fellow survivors but competitors, rivals for the limited resource of the narrow passage, contestants in a game where the prize was continued existence, and the penalty was consumption, transformation, becoming just another voice in the endless dark. The four survivors stood at the mouth of the fissure, their bodies arranged in a semicircle that was less a formation and more a standoff, each one positioned to watch the others while simultaneously watching the creature that hung from the ceiling above them like a judgment suspended in time. The red bioluminescence pulsed in rhythms that matched the echolocation clicks, creating an environment that was not just dark but actively hostile to human perception. A space where the normal categories of sight and sound had been replaced by a predator's sensory system that rendered them visible in ways they could not understand and exposed in ways they could not prevent. Matteo was the first to speak, his voice carrying the flat resignation of someone who has already made his decision and is now simply announcing it to people who may or may not accept it. "I am the slowest," he said, the words emerging with a clarity that surprised them all, given the circumstances, given the creature, given the proximity of death that pressed against them from every direction. "I am old, I am tired, I am broken by what I have heard. My daughter's voice is in its collection now. My breath would only add to what it has already taken from my family. I will not go through the fissure. I will stay. I will be the distraction. I will be the sacrifice that buys the rest of you the time to escape." "No," Lena had said, the word emerging before she could stop it, before she could consider the strategic implications, before she could weigh the cost of the objection against the benefit of an extra body in the climb. "No, we don't leave anyone. We didn't come here to sacrifice each other. We came here to explore, to document, to understand. We came here as a team." "We came here as fools," Matteo had replied, and there was no bitterness in his voice, no recrimination, only the simple acknowledgement of a fact that was beyond dispute. "And now we must choose which fools survive. The fissure is narrow. The climb will be long. The creature will follow. Someone must stay. Someone must make noise. Someone must draw its attention while the others climb. And I am the logical choice. I am the oldest. I am the weakest. I am the one with nothing left to lose." "It's not about logic," Priya had whispered, her voice carrying the tremor of someone who has seen too much death in too short a time, who has watched her academic dreams dissolve into the reality of predation and consumption. "It's not about who's slowest or who's oldest. It's about what we become if we leave someone behind. It's about what survives in us if we sacrifice another person to save ourselves." "What survives in you is survival," Matteo had said, his voice gentle now, the voice of a grandfather speaking to children he knows he will never see grow old. "What survives in you is the chance to tell this story, to warn others, to close this place forever. My death is a price. Your survival is the purchase. Do not waste it on guilt. Do not waste it on regret. Use it to make sure that no one else follows these stairs. No one else hears these voices. No one else becomes part of this collection." The creature had shifted above them, a subtle adjustment of its hanging position that produced no sound, but generated a wave of displaced air that pressed against their faces like a hand, like a warning, like a reminder that the time for discussion was ending and the time for action was beginning. Its wings had unfolded slightly, the membrane stretching between the structural elements with a sound that was not audible but was felt as a vibration in the chest cavity, a pressure against the lungs that made breathing more difficult, more noticeable, more loud. "It's preparing," Gabriel had breathed, his eyes fixed on the creature with the same intensity he had once directed at enemy positions in Syrian bunkers, the same analytical focus that had kept him alive through firefights and mortar attacks and the random violence of modern warfare. "It's getting ready to move. It's calculating. It's deciding which of us to take first." "Then we decide first," Lena had said, and the words carried a weight of authority that she had not known she possessed, a leadership that emerged not from confidence but from desperation, not from planning but from necessity. "Matteo stays. We go, we climb, we don't look back, we don't make noise, we don't hesitate. And when we reach the surface, we seal this place. We bury it, we burn it. We do whatever it takes to make sure that nothing ever comes out of this hole again." The decision had been made. The choice had been forced upon them not by malice but by geometry, not by cruelty but by the simple reality of a passage that was too narrow for four and a creature that was too fast to outrun. Matteo had turned to face the creature, his body positioning itself between the fissure and the death bat, his arms spread wide in a posture that was not surrender but defiance, not submission but challenge. He had begun to speak, not in English, not in Spanish, but in Kayich, Maya, the language of his ancestors, the language of the Popol Vuh, the language of the myths that had predicted this moment and had offered in their terrible wisdom the only response that was possible when facing a god of death. The offering of self, the surrender of breath, the acceptance of transformation into something other than human. "You take my voice," Matteo had said, his voice rising in volume with each word growing louder and more confident as he shed the silence that had protected them and embraced the noise that would destroy him. "You take my breath, you take my years, but you will not take them." He gestured toward the fissure where the others were already squeezing themselves into the narrow space, their bodies scraping against the limestone walls, their hands finding holds in the irregular surface, their feet pushing against projections that might have been natural formations or might have been carved for exactly this purpose. "They will escape, they will tell the story, they will close the door, and you will wait in darkness, you will wait in silence, you will wait for prey that does not come." The creature had moved, not with the blinding speed of its first attack, but with a deliberation that suggested interest, curiosity, the attention of a collector who has encountered a specimen that is different from the usual offerings, that offers something unique in its defiance. It had descended from the ceiling in a spiral pattern that was hypnotic in its grace, its wings creating pockets of displaced air that pressed against Matteo's body from multiple directions, that seemed to be sampling him, testing him, evaluating the quality of the breath that he was offering. And Matteo had begun to sing. Not a song in the modern sense, not a melody with verses and choruses, but a chant, a prayer, a sequence of sounds that was older than the human species, older than the current geological epoch, a sequence that had been passed down through generations of Kayich, Maya as the true name of the forest, the secret designation that was supposed to have power over creatures like Camazotz, the banishing formula that was supposed to drive the death bat back into the depths from which it had emerged. The creature had paused. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, it had hung in the air before Matteo, its leaf-shaped nose pointed at his mouth, its eye pits absorbing the sound of his voice, its body still, attentive, waiting. And then it had struck. Not with a wing this time, not with the surgical decapitation that had taken Walter, but with its mouth, its terrible mouth that opened to reveal not teeth but something else, something that was not biological in any recognizable sense, something that was a void, a vacuum, a space where sound went to die. It had pressed its mouth against Matteo's mouth, and it had inhaled. The sound of the inhalation was the most terrible thing that Lena heard in her entire life, worse than the decapitation, worse than the screaming, worse than the voices of the dead. It was the sound of a life being drawn out through the mouth, of breath being extracted against the will, of the essential acoustic signature of a human being vacuumed into a space that was not a stomach but a library, not a digestive system but a recording device. Matteo's body had changed during the process. It had aged, it had withered, it had collapsed in on itself like a balloon losing air, like a fire losing oxygen, like a star collapsing into a black hole. His skin had wrinkled, his cheeks had hollowed, his eyes had sunk into their sockets until he looked not like a man but like a mummy, a desiccated husk that bore only a superficial resemblance to the guide who had led them into the darkness and was now, in his final act, leading them out of it. But the inhalation had taken time, longer than Walter's, longer than Sophia's. Matteo's chant had resisted the process, had slowed it, had created a duration of distraction that was exactly what the others needed to begin their climb. They had squeezed into the fissure with the desperation of people who have watched a sacrifice, and know that the only way to honor it is to survive, to escape, to make the sacrifice meaningful by ensuring that it was not in vain. Lena had gone first, her archaeologist's body smaller and more flexible than Gabriel's, her hands finding holds in the limestone that she could not see but could feel, her feet pushing against projections that she could only locate through the desperate sensitivity of skin against stone. Behind her came Priya, her graduate student's frame even smaller, her movements quicker but less confident, her breath coming in gasps that she tried to suppress, that she tried to control, that she tried to render silent even as her lungs screamed for oxygen, and her heart hammered against her ribs with a volume that she was certain the creature could hear. And behind Priya came Gabriel, his larger body struggling in the narrow space, his shoulders scraping against the walls with a sound that was not loud but was loud enough, that generated vibrations that traveled through the stone and into the chamber below, that announced their position to a creature that was now, presumably, finished with Mateo and ready for its next course. They had climbed. The fissure led upward at an angle that was steep but not vertical, a chimney that had been formed by water or by pressure or by something else entirely, its walls irregular enough to provide holds but smooth enough to make each hold precarious, each movement dangerous, each decision a gamble between the risk of falling and the risk of making noise. They had climbed in darkness, their headlamps dead, their only illumination the faint phosphorescence of mineral deposits that glowed with just enough light to transform the void into the suggestion of walls, the hint of surfaces, the ghost of a passage that might lead to safety or might lead to another trap. And below them they had heard the creature, not as sound but as pressure, not as vibration but as presence, the displacement of air that marked its movement through the chamber, the rhythmic pulses of its echolocation that mapped the fissure and found them in it, found their warm bodies and their beating hearts and their desperate breathing. It was following. It was hunting. It was climbing after them with a speed that was impossible for something of its size, a maneuverability that defied the constraints of physics, a determination that suggested not hunger but completion, not predation but protocol, the need to finish what had been started, to collect what had been promised, to close the account that had been opened when they descended the stairs. Faster, Gabriel had breathed, his voice barely audible, his body wedged in a section of the fissure that was narrower than the rest, his chest compressed to the point where breathing was difficult, where movement was painful, where the urge to scream was building with each passing second. It's coming. I can feel it. The pressure is getting stronger. It's getting closer. I can't, Priya had whimpered, her voice breaking under the strain of terror and exhaustion, her body shaking with the accumulated trauma of 2 days in darkness. I'm stuck. I can't move. My shoulder is wedged. I can't. Push, Lena had commanded, her voice emerging from the darkness above with an authority that surprised her, that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind. Push with your feet. Rotate your shoulder. Don't pull back, push forward. Use your legs, use your hips. You can do this. You have to do this. But Priya could not do it. Her body, small and flexible as it was, had reached a point of exhaustion where muscle would no longer obey will, where the signals from the brain were lost in the noise of terror, where the physical reality of the narrow fissure had become an absolute barrier that could not be overcome by determination or by technique, or by the desperate need to survive. She was stuck, and the creature was climbing toward her, its echolocation pulses growing stronger with each passing moment, its presence filling the fissure like water filling a pipe, like darkness filling a room, like death filling a life. Go, Priya had said, her voice carrying a resignation that was older than her years, that spoke of generations of ancestors who had faced death with dignity, who had accepted the inevitable with grace, who had understood that survival was not always possible, and that the manner of one's death could be as important as the fact of it. Go, both of you, leave me. I'll be the noise, I'll be the distraction, I'll be the next voice in the darkness, but you have to survive, you have to tell them, you have to make sure that no one else comes here, no one else follows the stairs, No one else believes the voices." "Priya, no," Lena had said, but even as she spoke the words she knew they were futile, that the geometry of the fissure allowed for only one direction of movement, that to go back would be to die alongside her student rather than survive to honor her memory. "We can get you out. We can find a way. We can." "There's no way," Priya had said, and her voice was calm now, peaceful, the voice of someone who has accepted the terms of her death and is now simply waiting for the transaction to be completed. "I'm not the fastest. I'm not the strongest. I'm the one who got stuck. And in this place, in this system, the one who gets stuck is the one who gets collected. That's the rule. That's the design. That's the way it works." She had begun to hum. Not a loud sound, not a defiant sound like Mateo's chant, but a soft sound, a gentle sound, a melody that Lena recognized after a moment of confused listening as a lullaby. A song that Priya's mother had sung to her when she was a child in Mumbai. A song that was supposed to bring comfort and sleep and safety. A song that was now being offered as a sacrifice, as a distraction, as the last acoustic signature that Priya Patel would produce before she became part of the creature's collection. "Go," she had whispered between notes of the lullaby. "Go now, while it listens, while it appreciates the music." Lena had climbed. She had climbed with tears streaming down her face, with guilt crushing her chest, with the knowledge that she was leaving behind a student who had trusted her, who had followed her, who had believed in the promise of archaeological discovery, and had found instead the reality of predatory consumption. She had climbed with Gabriel behind her, his larger body moving with a speed that spoke of the same guilt, the same desperation, the same need to make the sacrifice meaningful by ensuring that at least some of them survived. And below them, the lullaby had stopped. Not gradually, not with the trailing off of someone who has finished singing, but instantly, completely, absolutely. The silence that followed, more terrible than the song, had been because it meant that the voice had been collected, that the breath had been taken, that Priya was now just another recording in the creature's library, another lure for the next group of curious humans who would descend the stairs. They had reached a junction in the fissure, a point where the passage split into two branches, one continuing upward at the same steep angle, the other leveling out into a horizontal passage that seemed to lead nowhere. Lena had paused, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief, and the desperate need to make a decision that would not result in another death, another loss, another voice added to the collection. "Up," Gabriel had said, his voice emerging from the darkness behind her with a certainty that surprised her. "Always up. The horizontal passage is another trap, another lure, another way to keep us moving sideways instead of escaping. The creature wants us to wander, to tire, to become confused, to make noise. Up is the only direction that leads out." They had climbed the upward branch, their hands bleeding from the limestone, their muscles screaming from the exertion, their lungs burning from the effort of breathing in the confined space. They had climbed for what felt like hours, for what might have been days, time losing all meaning in the darkness, all relevance in the pursuit, all substance in the face of a predator that did not operate on human schedules or human limitations. And then they had heard it, the echolocation, not from below, where the creature had been following them through the fissure, but from above, from somewhere in the passage ahead, from a position that suggested the creature had somehow gotten ahead of them, had somehow found another route, had somehow positioned itself to intercept them at the point where they were most vulnerable, most exhausted, most ready to surrender. "It can't be," Gabriel had breathed, his voice carrying the despair of someone who has done everything right and has still failed, who has followed every rule and has still been caught, who has made every sacrifice and has still been denied the reward. "It was behind us. It was following us. It can't be ahead of us. It can't." "It can," Lena had said, her archaeologist's mind finding the explanation even in the midst of terror, the understanding that emerged from the accumulated data of their descent, the patterns that they had observed in the cave's geometry. The passages connect. The fissure is not a straight line. It branches, it loops, it doubles back on itself. The creature knows this cave better than we ever could. It knows the shortcuts. It knows the connections. It knows how to get ahead of us. It knows how to hurt us. They had stopped, not out of choice but out of necessity, their bodies pressed against the walls of the fissure, their minds racing through possibilities that were all bad, all fatal, all leading to the same conclusion. They were trapped. The creature was behind them and ahead of them, above them and below them in every direction at once, and the only direction that remained was inward, deeper, toward the center, toward the heart, toward the place where the collection was completed and the voices were stored. "The leaf knows," Lena had said, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of studying biology, of understanding ecology, of recognizing that every predator had weaknesses, every system had flaws, every monster had a vulnerability that could be exploited if only one could find it. The leaf-shaped nose, it's a focusing apparatus. It directs the sound pulses, creates a beam, a sonic scalpel. "Yes," Gabriel had breathed, his war correspondent's mind recognizing the shift in Lena's tone, the transition from despair to calculation, from victim to agent. "We discussed this. It's how it maps. It's how it hunts." "Then what happens if we disrupt the focus?" Lena had asked, the question emerging with the force of revelation, the possibility of survival crystallizing from the chaos of terror into a plan, a strategy, a hope. What happens if we create a sound that interferes with its echolocation, a frequency that scrambles its mapping, a noise that makes it blind? "Blind," Gabriel had repeated, the word carrying the weight of comprehension, the understanding that in this world of darkness, blindness was not the absence of sight but the absence of mapping, not the failure of eyes but the failure of echolocation. You mean we create a countersound, a jamming signal, like radar jamming, like acoustic camouflage." "Like survival," Lena had said, and for the first time since Walter's death she felt something other than terror. She felt hope. Fragile, desperate, probably futile hope, but hope nonetheless. The possibility that they were not just prey, not just resources, not just voices waiting to be collected, but agents, actors, participants in a struggle where the outcome was not yet determined. They had searched their equipment with desperate hands, their fingers finding the objects that they had carried into the cave, and that had seemed useless in the darkness. The cameras, the recording devices, the electronic equipment that was designed to document and to capture and to preserve. Gabriel had found his portable audio recorder, a professional device that he had used to capture ambient sound for his documentaries, a machine that could generate frequencies across the entire audible spectrum and beyond, into the ultrasonic range where the creature operated. "The leaf-nosed bats," Lena had said, her voice carrying the excitement of discovery even in the midst of horror, the academic's instinct to understand overriding even the survival instinct that should have been dominating her consciousness. "Modern leaf-nosed bats use their nose leaves to focus sound into a narrow beam. If we can generate a frequency that matches their echolocation but is out of phase, we can create interference. We can create a blind spot, a zone where the creature can't map, where it can't see." "For how long?" Gabriel had asked, his hands already working on the recorder, his fingers finding the controls by touch, setting the device to generate a high-frequency tone at maximum volume. "I don't know," Lena had admitted. "Seconds, maybe minutes, maybe just long enough for us to get past it, to find another passage, to keep climbing." "Then we do it now," Gabriel had said, and his thumb hovered over the activation button, his body tensed for the action that would either save them or announce their position to a predator that was already too close, already too aware, already too ready to collect. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. He had pressed the button. The sound that emerged from the recorder was not audible to human ears, not in the conventional sense, but it was felt as a pressure against the eardrums, a vibration in the sinus cavities, a tingling in the dental nerves that suggested the generation of a frequency that was operating at the upper limits of human perception and beyond. It was a scream in ultrasound, a shout in the language of bats, a declaration of acoustic war in a medium where sound was the only currency that mattered. And it worked. Not dramatically, not completely, not in the way that a weapon works when it destroys an enemy, but subtly, partially, in the way that a distraction works when it creates an opening, a moment of confusion, a brief window of opportunity in which the normal rules are suspended, and the prey becomes, for an instant, the agent of its own escape. The creature had reacted, not with anger, not with pain, but with disorientation, its echolocation pulses suddenly returning conflicting data, its carefully constructed acoustic map of the fissure suddenly fragmenting into noise and static and meaningless vibration. It had paused in its ascent, its body hanging in the air below them with a stillness that suggested confusion, that suggested the predator's equivalent of blindness, the sudden loss of the sensory system that was its primary means of navigation and hunting. "Go," Lena had commanded, her voice barely audible over the ultrasonic scream of the recorder, her body already moving, already climbing, already taking advantage of the window that Gabriel's device had opened. "Go now, while it's confused, while it's blind, while we have the chance." They had climbed with a speed that was reckless, that was dangerous, that generated sounds that under normal circumstances would have been fatal, but that in this moment were masked by the acoustic interference of the recorder, drowned in the ultrasonic noise that was scrambling the creature's perception. They had climbed past the point where the creature had been waiting, past the junction where it had positioned itself, past the place where it had expected to collect them, and instead found only confusion and noise and the frustrating absence of clear targets. And then they had found it, the surface. Not the surface in the sense of the cenote where they had entered, not the stairs that had delivered them to the underworld, but a different surface, a different exit, a crack in the earth's skin that opened onto the sky, onto the air, onto the world of light and sound and breathable atmosphere that they had thought they would never see again. The light had been blinding. After 2 days in absolute darkness, the sunlight of the Guatemalan highlands had struck their retinas like a physical blow, producing pain that was welcome because it meant they were alive. It meant they were out. It meant they had escaped the darkness and the creature and the collection that had consumed Walter and Sophia and Mateo and Priya and countless others whose names they would never know. They had emerged into a landscape that was both familiar and alien. The jungle that they had left 11 days earlier transformed by their experience into something that was no longer background but foreground, no longer scenery but substance, every leaf and every branch and every bird call carrying the weight of significance, the texture of reality, the preciousness of a world that they had almost lost forever. They had lain on the ground for a long time, their bodies shaking with the aftermath of terror, their minds reeling with the impossibility of what they had experienced, their lungs drinking the air with a gratitude that was physical, visceral, more intense than any emotion they had ever felt. They had wept. Not silently, not in the controlled way of the cave, but openly, loudly, their sobs rising into the air of the jungle with a freedom that was itself a victory, a declaration that they were still human, still alive, still capable of producing sounds that belonged to them rather than to the creature that had tried to collect them. "We made it," Gabriel had said, his voice hoarse, broken, the voice of someone who has survived something that should have killed him and is still trying to process the fact of his continued existence. "We actually made it. We're alive. We're out." "We made it," Lena had repeated, but even as she spoke the words she felt the hollowness of them, the incompleteness, the knowledge that survival was not the same as escape, that exiting the cave was not the same as leaving the experience behind, that the creature was still down there, still waiting, still hungry, still collecting voices that would lure future victims into its domain. They had walked through the jungle without direction or purpose, moving because stillness felt like surrender, the motion of their bodies the only proof they were still alive. They found a road, then a village, then help, and then endured the long months of debriefing and hospitalization and therapy that followed. The official story had been that the expedition had encountered a cave collapse, that Walter and Matteo and Priya had been killed by falling rock, that Sophia had died in a separate incident, a fall into the cenote that had been unrelated to the main expedition, that Lena and Gabriel had survived through luck and determination and the timely discovery of an alternative exit. The truth had been too strange, too impossible, too unbelievable to be included in any official report, and Lena had learned quickly that no one wanted to hear about creatures that collected voices, about caves that were designed to trap the curious, about a predator that farmed human breath like a crop. But the truth had remained with her, in her dreams, in her waking moments, in the silences between conversations and the pauses between heartbeats. The truth had remained with her like a scar, like a wound that would not heal, like a voice that would not be silenced. It was 3 months later when she heard it again. She was standing in a bus station in Guatemala City, waiting for the transport that would take her to the airport, to the flight that would carry her back to Berkeley, and to the life that she had left behind and that she was not sure she could ever fully rejoin. The station was crowded, hot, filled with the sounds of diesel engines and shouted conversations, and the music that spilled from the radios of waiting vehicles. And then, from somewhere above her, from the rafters of the bus station where pigeons nested and homeless cats hunted, came a sound that stopped her heart, that froze her blood, that transformed the bustling station into a space of absolute terror. Lena Mija. Her father's voice, not similar to her father's. Her father's voice, preserved in the collection of the creature, reproduced with perfect fidelity, emerging from the darkness of the rafters with a clarity that suggested the speaker was close, was present, was real. "I've been waiting," the voice said, and it was warm, and it was loving, and it was absolutely, completely, unmistakably wrong. "Come and see. I've found something wonderful, something important, something that will change everything. Come and see, Mija, come and be with me." Lena had looked up. She had looked up at the rafters of the bus station, her eyes straining against the shadows, her mind racing through explanations that were all inadequate, all impossible, all pointing to a truth that she did not want to accept. And she had seen it, not the creature itself. The creature was too large to fit in a bus station rafter, too massive to hide in a space designed for pigeons. But she had seen something, a shape, a suggestion of wings, a hint of the leaf-shaped nose that focused the sound, a glimpse of the eye pits that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was not the same Camazotz. It could not be. The creature in the cave had been enormous, ancient, a thing that had existed in the depths for millennia. But the shape in the rafters had been smaller, younger, a thing that might have been a normal bat except for the proportions, except for the wrongness, except for the sense that it was not a creature but a fragment of something larger, a piece of the darkness that had followed her out of the cave and into the world of light. Or perhaps it was the same creature. Perhaps Camazotz was not a single organism but a species, a type, a category of being that existed in multiple forms across multiple spaces, that hunted in the depths of the earth and in the shadows of human civilization, that collected voices not just in caves but in cities, not just in jungles but in bus stations, not just in the past but in the present and the future and the endless stretch of time that lay ahead. "It followed us," Gabriel had said, his voice barely audible, his body pressed against hers in the crowded station, his eyes fixed on the rafters with an expression that was not surprise but resignation, not shock but acceptance. Or it sent a piece of itself, or it was always here, waiting, watching, collecting. The hunger, Lena had whispered, the realization emerging with a clarity that was worse than the confusion it replaced. The hunger of the legend, it didn't stay in the cave, it moved, it followed the voices, it followed us. The shape in the rafters had moved. Not attacked, not descended, not swept down with the surgical precision of decapitation, but shifted, adjusted, turned its leaf-shaped nose in their direction. And from that nose had come the pulses, the echolocation, the acoustic mapping that Lena could feel as a pressure against her eardrums, a vibration in her sinuses, a subsonic massage of her inner ear that built a three-dimensional image of her body in the creature's mind. It was mapping her, in the bus station, in the city, in the world of light and civilization and human community. It was mapping her, and it was learning her, and it was preparing to collect her at some future moment when she was alone, when she was vulnerable, when she had forgotten the lessons of the cave and had begun to breathe loudly again, to move freely again, to live as if she were safe. "We need to go," Gabriel had said, his hand on her arm, his grip tight with the same desperation that had carried them through the fissure and out of the cave. "We need to move. We need to get to the airport. We need to get out of Guatemala. We need to tell people. We need to warn them. We need to make sure." "No one will believe us," Lena had said, and the words carried the weight of experience, the knowledge that she had gained in the months since the escape, the certainty that the truth was too strange, too impossible, too far outside the boundaries of acceptable reality to be heard by anyone who had not experienced it directly. "They'll call us crazy, they'll call us traumatized, they'll call us survivors of a cave collapse who invented a monster to explain the deaths of our colleagues. They'll medicate us, they'll institutionalize us, they'll silence us." "Then we don't tell them everything," Gabriel had said, his war correspondent's mind finding the strategy even in the midst of renewed terror, the practical framework that might allow them to survive not just the creature but the aftermath of encountering it. "We tell them enough. We document enough. We build a record that can't be dismissed, that can't be ignored, that can't be explained away as trauma or hallucination or mental illness. We become the witnesses, the archivists, the ones who keep the story alive until the world is ready to hear it." They had moved. They had moved through the bus station with a speed that was not quite running, not quite walking, but something in between, something that spoke of controlled panic, of disciplined terror, of the survival instinct operating at maximum efficiency. They had reached the bus, boarded it, ridden it to the airport, passed through security, boarded the plane, flown to Los Angeles, and then to San Francisco, and then to the apartments and the therapists and the support groups and the long, slow process of building a life that included the memory of the cave but was not defined by it. But the voice had followed, not physically. They had not seen the shape again, had not heard the father's voice again, had not felt the pressure of the echolocation in the months that followed, but psychologically, emotionally, in the spaces between sleep and waking, in the moments of silence when the ambient noise of the city dropped below the threshold of perception, in the dreams that were not dreams but memories, not fantasies but recordings of events that had happened and that could not be undone. Lena had tried to warn people. She had written papers, given lectures, posted online, reached out to colleagues and journalists and anyone who would listen. She had described the cave, the stairs, the creature, the collection of voices, the system that was designed to bring people in and keep them there until they were ready to be harvested. She had been called a conspiracy theorist, a trauma survivor, a mentally ill academic who had invented a monster to explain the deaths of people she had led into danger. And the cave had remained open. The cenote had not been sealed. The stairs had not been destroyed. The farmers still made the sign of the cross when they passed the sinkhole, still muttered about La Boca de Camazotz, still warned their children not to approach the mouth of the death bat. But the warnings were dismissed as superstition, as folklore, as the ignorant fears of people who did not understand the scientific method and the principles of geological formation. And people had continued to disappear. Hikers, archaeologists, treasure hunters, curious tourists, not in large numbers. The creature did not need large numbers. It needed quality, not quantity. It needed voices that would lure other voices, breaths that would attract other breaths, lives that would promise the possibility of more lives. It farmed slowly, carefully, patiently, with a timescale that was measured not in days or months, but in centuries, in millennia, in the long spans of geological time that rendered human civilization as ephemeral as mayfly emergence. Lena had learned to live with the knowledge. She had learned to sleep with the memory of the decapitation, to work with the awareness of the creature's existence, to love and to laugh, and to experience joy with the understanding that these things were temporary, that the darkness was patient, that the collection would continue long after she was gone. She had learned to be a witness, an archivist, a keeper of the story that no one wanted to hear but that everyone needed to know. And sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, when the city was silent and the darkness outside her window was complete, she would hold her breath and listen. Listen for the pressure against her eardrums. Listen for the subsonic vibration in her sinuses. Listen for the acoustic mapping that would tell her that the creature had found her, that it was waiting, that it was patient, that it would come for her when she was ready, when she was ripe, when her voice had become interesting enough to add to the collection. She would hold her breath and she would wait, and in the silence she would sometimes hear or think she heard the faintest suggestion of a voice. Not her father's voice, not Walter's voice, not Mateo's or Priya's or Sophia's, but her own voice calling from somewhere in the darkness, from somewhere in the future, from somewhere in the collection that waited for her at the end of the journey. "Come and see," the voice would whisper, and it was warm and it was welcoming and it was absolutely, completely, terrifyingly familiar. "Come and see what I've found. Come and be with me. Come and be part of the darkness. Come and let go of the light." And she would exhale, slowly, carefully, silently, and she would tell herself that it was not real, that it was imagination, that it was the product of trauma and grief, and the long shadows cast by an experience that had scarred her in ways she was still learning to understand. But she would never be sure. She would never be certain that the voice was not real, that the creature had not already begun to collect her, that her breath was not already part of the library, that her years were not already being counted in the darkness of the cave that had become, for her, not a place but a condition, not a location but a state of being, not a memory but a prophecy of the death that waited for all who heard the dinner bell and followed it into the dark. She lived, she breathed, she spoke, she loved, she aged, and in the back of her mind, in the deepest chamber of her consciousness, she knew that Camazotz was still there, still waiting, still mapping, still patient, still hungry. The Echo of Xibalba was not a place you visited. It was a condition you entered, and once entered, it could never be fully escaped. The creature had let her go, not because it could not catch her, but because it knew, with the certainty of millennia, with the patience of stone, with the hunger of the void, that she would return. Not in body, perhaps, but in voice, in breath. In the acoustic signature of a life that had been touched by the darkness, and would carry that touch until the final exhalation, until the last word, until the silence that was not an ending but a beginning, not a death but a collection, not a loss but a transformation into something that would exist forever in the library of the death bat, in the archives of Xibalba. In the eternal darkness, where the only currency was sound, and the only transaction was the exchange of breath for silence, of life for echo, of being for the endless, patient, hungry waiting of the creature that had been there before them and would be there after, that had collected voices before human speech existed, and would continue to collect them long after human voices had faded into the silence of a world that had learned, finally and completely, that the darkness was not empty. It was full of voices, full of breath, full of the years that had been taken and stored and replayed and used to lure more years, more breath, more voices, in an endless cycle of consumption and collection that would continue until the last human being held their breath in the dark and listened for the pressure against their eardrums and knew, with absolute certainty, that the mapping was complete. And the dinner bell was ringing. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe. so you don't miss the stories yet to come.